You feel overwhelmed by workplace pressures that seem to multiply daily, and every setback shakes your confidence to its core. The stress is affecting your sleep, your health, and your happiness outside of work, while you watch others maintain their composure under similar pressures, leaving you wondering what secret they possess that you don't. I am Marcus Aurelius, and I maintained unshakable inner peace while ruling the most powerful empire in history, bearing the weight of millions of lives on my shoulders. Through plagues, wars, betrayals, and the constant burden of absolute power, I developed a fortress of the mind that no external force could penetrate. The Stoic principles I'll share will give you that same fortress of calm that no workplace pressure can breach, using the same philosophy that sustained me through the darkest times an emperor could face. Whether you're ruling an empire or managing your career, the fundamentals of inner strength and mental resilience remain as powerful today as they were in ancient Rome. But first, like this video, subscribe for more timeless Stoic wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to build their inner citadel. I was 17 when Antoninus Pius first placed the heavy imperial purple cloak around my shoulders during a ceremonial rehearsal. The weight of that garment, not just its physical mass but everything it represented, nearly brought me to my knees. Most young men my age were concerned with chariot races, poetry, or pursuing romantic interests. I was being groomed to inherit absolute power over the known world. The purple cloak became my constant teacher. Every time I wore it, I felt the weight of 60 million souls who would one day depend on my decisions. Every thread reminded me that with ultimate authority comes ultimate responsibility. But here's what I learned that most people in positions of power never understand. External authority means absolutely nothing without inner discipline. You see this same principle playing out in modern workplaces every day. You watch managers who have the title but lack the character. They have the authority to make decisions, but they crumble under pressure because they never develop the internal strength to match their external position. They might wear the metaphorical purple of leadership, but they're empty vessels making noise. When I first began my philosophical studies under Junius Rusticus, he taught me something that transformed how I viewed power entirely. He said, "Marcus, anyone can give orders. The question is, who are you when no one is watching? Who are you when the pressure mounts? Who are you when everything goes wrong?" These questions haunted me in the best possible way. I remember one particular evening when I was 19. Antoninus had tasked me with resolving a complex trade dispute that threatened to disrupt grain supplies to the city. The representatives from Egypt and Gaul were at each other's throats, each threatening to withdraw from negotiations. The easy path would have been to use imperial authority to simply impose a solution. Instead, I spent hours listening to both sides, understanding their underlying concerns, and finding a path that honored both parties' essential needs. That night, alone in my chambers, I realized something profound. True power isn't about imposing your will on others. True power is about imposing your will on yourself. It's about maintaining your principles when it would be easier to compromise. It's about staying calm when everyone around you is panicking. It's about making decisions based on what's right, not what's expedient. This is where most modern professionals get it backwards. They think if they just get the promotion, the corner office, the impressive title, then they'll somehow develop the confidence and composure to handle the responsibility. But it doesn't work that way. The external trappings of success are meaningless if you haven't built the internal foundation to support them. I spent years preparing for the weight of the purple by first learning to carry the weight of my own character. Every morning, I would examine my thoughts and motivations. Every evening, I would review my actions and decisions. I practiced the discipline of wanting what I had rather than constantly craving what I lacked. I trained myself to see obstacles as opportunities to practice virtue. The Stoic philosophers taught me that there are only 3 things that matter in this life: what you think, what you say, and what you do. Everything else, your title, your salary, your office, other people's opinions of you, is outside your control and therefore outside your concern. This wasn't just abstract philosophy for me. This was practical training for the most demanding job in the world. When Antoninus finally died and I became emperor in my own right, I was ready not because I had mastered the art of ruling others, but because I had begun to master the art of ruling myself. The purple cloak that once felt impossibly heavy now felt like a natural extension of who I had become. The same principle applies to whatever position of responsibility you're seeking or currently hold. Whether you're managing a team of 5 or leading a company of 5,000, the fundamental challenge is the same: developing the internal discipline to match your external responsibilities. I want you to understand something that took me years to fully grasp. The marketplace doesn't care about your feelings. Your customers don't care if you're having a bad day. Your team doesn't care if you're feeling overwhelmed. They need you to be the person who can handle whatever comes, who can make difficult decisions under pressure, who can maintain composure when everything is falling apart. But here's the beautiful paradox I discovered. When you stop needing external validation and start living according to your internal compass, you actually become far more effective at handling external challenges. When you're not constantly worried about protecting your ego or managing other people's perceptions, you can focus all your energy on doing what needs to be done. The purple cloak taught me that leadership isn't a privilege, it's a burden. And the only way to carry that burden with grace is to build the internal strength to support it. Every challenge becomes an opportunity to practice virtue. Every setback becomes a chance to demonstrate resilience. Every crisis becomes a moment to show who you really are when the pressure is on. The scroll I kept during the Antonine Plague contains some of the darkest entries I ever wrote, yet it also represents my greatest triumph as a Stoic practitioner. When death swept through Rome like an invisible army, claiming thousands daily, I learned what it truly means to focus only on what you can control. I'll never forget the morning I received the first reports from my physicians. Bodies were piling up faster than we could burn them. The aqueducts ran red with blood from victims coughing their lives away. Citizens fled the city in panic, abandoning their posts, their duties, their very humanity in the face of invisible terror. This wasn't an enemy I could face with legions or defeat with strategy. This was raw, merciless nature asserting its dominion over human ambition. My advisors begged me to leave Rome, to establish the imperial court in some distant, untouched province. The practical arguments were compelling. How could I lead the empire if I died of plague? Wouldn't self-preservation serve the greater good? But I knew in my bones that running would destroy something more valuable than my life. It would destroy the idea that leaders stay with their people when darkness falls. Here's what I learned during those terrible months that applies to every crisis you'll face in your professional life. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford when others depend on you, when your company faces a massive client loss, when your department gets restructured, when your industry gets disrupted by forces beyond anyone's control. The people around you will look to see how you respond. Your composure in crisis becomes their anchor in chaos. I established a daily routine during the plague that saved my sanity and my effectiveness. Each morning I would review what I could and could not control. I could control my decisions about resource allocation. I could control my communications to the people. I could control my own behavior and example. I could not control who lived or died. I could not control the fear in people's hearts. I could not control when the plague would end. This distinction became my lifeline. When you're drowning in circumstances beyond your control, the only way to survive is to grab onto the few things that remain within your power and hold them with absolute determination. I focused obsessively on being useful where I could be. Useful and accepting what I had to accept. Every day, I walked through the makeshift hospitals we established in public buildings. Not because my presence could heal anyone, but because leaders must witness the full reality of what they're managing. I spoke with families who had lost everything. I made decisions about how to distribute diminishing medical supplies. I wrote letters to provincial governors coordinating our response across the empire, but the real battle was happening inside my own mind. The Stoic discipline I had practiced for years became my survival tool. When grief threatened to overwhelm me after visiting a children's ward where small bodies lay still forever, I reminded myself that mourning the dead serves no one if it prevents you from helping the living. When anger rose at the unfairness of plague striking good people, while corrupt officials fled to safety, I channeled that energy into actionable decisions rather than useless rage. The key insight that got me through the darkest period was this: your emotional response to a crisis doesn't change the crisis, but it determines your effectiveness in handling it. I could choose to be paralyzed by the magnitude of suffering around me, or I could be galvanized by the opportunities to serve. That suffering presented, every morning I chose service over paralysis. I want you to understand how this applies to your current professional challenges. When your industry faces disruption, when your company struggles with declining revenues, when your team faces impossible deadlines, you have the same choice I faced during the plague. You can focus on the unfairness, the impossibility, the factors beyond your control, or you can focus on what you can actually influence within the situation. During the plague's worst months, I developed what I called useful action meditation. Before making any decision, I would ask myself 3 questions. Is this action within my control? Will this action serve others, or just serve my own emotional needs? Will this action move us toward a solution, or just make me feel better temporarily? These questions filtered out 90% of the worry and panic that could have consumed my mental energy. They forced me to channel my emotional response into practical effectiveness. When you're facing your own professional plague, whether it's a toxic work environment, an impossible project, or an industry in decline, these same questions can be your anchor. I remember one specific night when the death reports reached their highest single-day total. I sat in my study, surrounded by scrolls, documenting the catastrophe, feeling the weight of every life lost. For a moment, I allowed myself to consider what would happen if I simply gave up, if I stopped fighting an enemy I couldn't see or defeat. But then I looked at the physician's journal I had been keeping, documenting not just the deaths, but our responses, our innovations, our small victories. I saw records of new hospital procedures that were saving lives. I saw correspondence with engineers who had improved water sanitation. I saw evidence that even in the face of unstoppable natural disaster, human beings could still choose to be useful, still choose to serve, still choose to respond with dignity rather than despair. That night I understood something that has guided me through every subsequent crisis. You are not responsible for controlling outcomes, but you are absolutely responsible for controlling your response to those outcomes. The plague taught me that leadership during crisis isn't about having all the answers or stopping all the pain. Leadership during crisis is about maintaining your ability to make useful decisions when useful decisions seem impossible. When the plague finally ended, we had lost nearly a third of Rome's population, but we had also proved something powerful about human resilience and the value of Stoic discipline under pressure. The empire survived not because we defeated the plague, but because we chose to remain functional and committed to service even while the plague defeated so many of us. Your professional plagues may not involve literal life and death, but the principle remains the same. When forces beyond your control threaten everything you've built, your response determines whether you emerge stronger or broken. The meditation scroll that survived my reign contains thoughts I never intended anyone else to read. These weren't grand philosophical treatises meant for public consumption. They were my private conversations with myself, my daily practice of building what I came to call the inner citadel. This fortress of the mind became my greatest achievement, more impregnable than than any physical walls around Rome. Let me explain what I mean by the inner citadel, because this concept will transform how you handle every pressure and setback in your professional life. Imagine a fortress so well constructed that no external attack can breach its walls. Now imagine that fortress exists entirely within your mind, protecting not your body, but your peace, your clarity, and your ability to respond rather than react. I discovered the blueprint for this citadel through what Stoics call the three disciplines: the discipline of desire, the discipline of action, and the discipline of assent. These aren't abstract philosophical concepts. They're practical tools for maintaining your mental sovereignty when everything around you descends into chaos. The discipline of desire taught me to want what I have rather than constantly craving what I lack. During my early years as emperor, I was tormented by the gap between how I wanted the empire to function and how it actually operated. I wanted senators who prioritized public good over personal gain. I wanted provincial governors who were incorruptible. I wanted military campaigns that ended swiftly with minimal casualties. I wanted plague to spare the innocent and plague-resistant crops to feed the hungry. This constant wanting was destroying my ability to govern effectively. I was spending so much mental energy lamenting what wasn't that I couldn't focus on working with what was. The discipline of desire meant training myself to accept reality as the starting point for improvement rather than as a disappointment to be resented. The practical application for your career is profound. How much of your mental energy are you wasting wanting your boss to be different, your colleagues to be more competent, your company to have better systems, your industry to be more rational? That energy spent wanting different circumstances is energy stolen from working effectively within current circumstances. I trained myself to replace "I wish this situation were different" with "given that this situation is what it is, what's the most useful response I can make?" This shift in thinking liberated enormous amounts of mental resources that I could then apply to actual problem solving. The discipline of action focused on doing what needed to be done while releasing attachment to outcomes beyond my control. I could control the quality of my decisions, but not their ultimate results. I could control the integrity of my communications, but not how others interpreted them. I could control my level of preparation for negotiations, but not the other party's willingness to negotiate in good faith. This discipline saved me during the Germanic Wars, when military strategies I had carefully developed met with unexpected resistance or unforeseen complications. Instead of becoming paralyzed by fear of failure or distracted by analyzing what went wrong, I could quickly adapt my approach based on new information while maintaining confidence in my decision-making process. In your professional context, this means focusing your energy on the quality of your work rather than on whether that work receives the recognition you believe it deserves. It means putting your best effort into presentations while remaining unattached to whether clients respond the way you hope. It means managing your team with integrity regardless of whether upper management appreciates your leadership style. The discipline of assent, controlling your judgments about events, became my most powerful tool for maintaining inner peace under pressure. External events themselves are neutral. Only our judgments about those events create our emotional responses. When Germanic tribes crossed our borders, the objective fact was simply that people were moving from one geographic location to another. My judgment that this movement threatened Roman security created my sense of urgency and determination to respond militarily. This wasn't denial or detachment from reality. This was recognition that my emotional response to events was entirely within my control, and that I could choose responses that served my effectiveness rather than just expressing my feelings. I developed a daily practice of examining my automatic judgments about situations. When a senator criticized my policies publicly, my immediate judgment might be, "This is disrespectful and undermines my authority." But I learned to pause and ask, is there useful information in this criticism? Is this person expressing legitimate concerns that I should address? How can I respond in a way that serves the public good rather than just defending my ego? This created what I call response space, a mental gap between stimulus and reaction where conscious choice becomes possible. Most people live their entire lives without ever experiencing this space. They react automatically to whatever happens around them, like leaves blown by wind. But when you build the inner citadel, you create a place of calm from which you can choose your responses based on your values rather than your impulses. The three disciplines work together to create unshakable inner stability. When you stop wanting circumstances to be different than they are, you can focus all your energy on working skillfully within those circumstances. When you act with integrity while releasing attachment to outcomes, you maintain your self-respect regardless of external results. When you control your judgments about events, you become immune to the emotional manipulation that keeps most people in constant turmoil. I practiced building this citadel every morning through written reflection and every evening through honest self-examination. I would write thoughts like, "Today I will encounter interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness. But I won't be surprised or disturbed, for I can't imagine a world without such people." This wasn't pessimism, it was preparation. By accepting difficult people and challenging situations as normal parts of life, I could respond to them calmly rather than being constantly frustrated by their existence. The inner citadel isn't built in a day. It requires consistent practice, daily reinforcement, and gradual strengthening over time. But once established, it becomes your most valuable professional asset. When your colleagues panic under pressure, you remain calm. When others react emotionally to setbacks, you respond strategically. When the workplace becomes chaotic, you become the eye of the storm, still, centered, and capable of clear thinking. This mental fortress travels with you wherever you go. No one can take it away. No external circumstance can breach it, and no amount of professional turbulence can shake the peace you've built within it. The emperors who came after me inherited the physical empire, but each person must build their own inner empire. That's the work only you can do, and it's the work that determines whether you'll be ruled by circumstances or rule over your own responses to them. The battle-worn map of the Germanic frontier that hung in my command tent bore stains of mud, blood, and wine from countless strategy sessions held under the worst possible conditions. For nearly a decade, I spent more time in military camps along the Danube than in the comfortable palaces of Rome. This map became my teacher in the most paradoxical lesson of leadership: how to maintain inner peace while waging external war. When I first arrived at the Germanic frontier, I was a philosopher emperor who had never led troops in actual combat. The seasoned generals under my command had fought more battles in a single year than I had witnessed in my entire life. I could feel their skepticism. Here was their scholarly emperor coming to play soldier, while they did the real work of protecting Rome's borders. But I quickly learned that war, like any extreme pressure situation, strips away pretense and reveals who you really are. The Stoic principles I had practiced in the quiet of my study would now be tested by the screams of dying men, the chaos of tactical decisions made under enemy fire, and the weight of sending thousands to their deaths based on my strategic choices. The first major battle taught me something that applies to every high-stakes situation you'll face in your career. When the pressure is highest, your preparation matters most. All those years of morning meditation, of practicing emotional discipline, of training myself to think clearly under stress, none of it was wasted academic exercise. It was preparation for moments when clear thinking meant the difference between victory and catastrophe. I remember standing on a hill overlooking the Germanic positions, watching enemy warriors who fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland against what they saw as Roman invasion. My initial judgment was simple. These are barbarians threatening Roman civilization. But then I applied the discipline of assent and asked myself harder questions. What would I do if foreign armies occupied Italian soil? How would I fight if I believed my family's survival depended on defeating an occupying force? This shift in perspective didn't make me any less committed to defending Roman interests, but it made me a more effective commander because I could understand my enemy's motivations. When you understand why people oppose you, you can anticipate their strategies and respond more intelligently to their tactics. The parallel to modern professional conflicts is striking. When you're facing aggressive competition, hostile takeover, attempts, or internal office politics, your first instinct might be to demonize your opponents. But the moment you start thinking of other people as simply evil or irrational, you lose your ability to predict and counter their moves effectively. During the siege of a Germanic stronghold that lasted 3 months, I faced my greatest test of Stoic leadership. Food supplies were running low, disease was spreading through our camp, and some of my officers were suggesting we retreat and regroup. The easy path would have been to withdraw, blame the weather or supply problems, and try again next season. The politically safe path would have been to avoid the risk of a major defeat that could damage my reputation. But I had learned that leadership isn't about choosing easy paths or safe options. Leadership is about making the decision that serves the larger good, regardless of personal cost. I chose to maintain the siege while implementing strict rationing, improved sanitation, and a series of limited attacks designed to weaken enemy morale without exposing our forces to unnecessary casualties. The decision required me to practice what I call detached engagement, complete commitment to the action while maintaining emotional equilibrium about the outcome. I threw everything I had into winning that siege, but I also accepted that failure was possible and that my worth as a leader wasn't dependent on any single victory or defeat. This is the paradox that most professionals never master. You must care deeply about your work while remaining unattached to specific outcomes. When you tie your self-worth to whether a particular project succeeds, whether a specific client signs with you, or whether your boss recognizes your contributions, you create unnecessary suffering for yourself and reduce your effectiveness under pressure. During those long nights in my command tent, planning the next day's operations while listening to the sounds of wounded soldiers in the medical tents, I developed what I called warrior meditation. Before each major decision, I would ask myself, am I acting from courage or from fear? Am I choosing this path because it serves the mission or because it protects my ego? If I die tomorrow, will I be proud of the choices I'm making today? These questions cut through the noise of battlefield politics, personal ambition, and emotional reactivity. They forced me to act from my deepest values rather than my surface anxieties. When you're facing your own professional battlefields, whether that's a hostile board meeting, a competitive presentation, or a department reorganization that threatens your position, these same questions can guide you toward responses that maintain your integrity while serving your effectiveness. The Germanic Wars also taught me the difference between productive and unproductive suffering. Soldiers who focused on how unfair it was that they had to fight in terrible weather became demoralized and ineffective. Soldiers who accepted difficult conditions as simply part of their duty maintained higher morale and performed better under stress. The external conditions were identical, but the internal response determined the outcome. You face this same choice every day in your professional life. You can spend mental energy resenting the parts of your job that are difficult, unfair, or unreasonable, or you can accept those challenges as opportunities to practice resilience and demonstrate your character. The work environment doesn't change based on your attitude toward it, but your effectiveness within that environment is completely determined by whether you approach challenges with resentment or with acceptance. After years of frontier warfare, I finally achieved a lasting peace with the Germanic tribes, not through total victory, but through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic negotiation that addressed their underlying concerns while protecting Roman interests. The lesson was profound. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from crushing your opposition, but from finding ways to transform conflict into cooperation. In your career, this might mean turning a hostile colleague into an ally by understanding their concerns, or resolving a client conflict by addressing the real needs behind their complaints rather than just defending your position. The skills you develop in high-pressure situations, emotional discipline, clear thinking under stress, the ability to see situations from multiple perspectives, become your greatest assets in all areas of professional life. The battle-stained map from my Germanic campaigns reminds me that every external conflict is also an internal war between your disciplined, rational self and your reactive, emotional self. The outcome of that inner war determines whether you'll handle external pressures with wisdom or be overwhelmed by them. Win the battle within yourself, and you'll be equipped to handle whatever battles the world presents. The simple wooden cup that sat on my desk throughout my reign was perhaps the most radical statement an emperor could make. While my predecessors drank from goblets of gold and silver encrusted with gems that could feed a family for years, I chose to drink water from a vessel any common soldier could afford. This cup became my daily reminder of the most liberating principle I ever learned. Wanting what you have is infinitely more powerful than having what you want. Most people spend their entire lives enslaved by the tyranny of if only, if only. I had a better boss, then I'd be happy at work. If only I got that promotion, then I'd feel secure. If only my company had better systems, then I could be truly productive. If only my colleagues were more competent, then I could achieve my goals. This endless cycle of conditional happiness is the source of most professional suffering. I learned this lesson the hard way during my early years as emperor. Despite having absolute power over the known world, I found myself constantly frustrated by the gap between how I wanted things to be and how they actually were. I wanted the Senate to be populated by virtuous statesmen instead of political opportunists. I wanted provincial governors to prioritize public service over personal enrichment. I wanted Roman citizens to embrace philosophy and virtue instead of pursuing entertainment and luxury. The irony was crushing. I had the power to command legions, to reshape laws, to redistribute wealth across an empire. Yet I was miserable because reality refused to conform to my preferences. I was the most powerful man in the world, and I was powerless to create the world I wanted to inhabit. Everything changed when my Stoic teachers helped me understand the difference between what I could and couldn't control. I could control my decisions, my responses, my character, and my actions. I could not control other people's choices, natural disasters, the passage of time, or the fundamental constraints of human nature. Once I accepted this distinction, my entire relationship with power transformed. Instead of resenting the Senate for being politically motivated, I started working skillfully within that political reality. Instead of being frustrated by corrupt governors, I developed better systems for oversight and accountability. Instead of lamenting that citizens preferred gladiator games to philosophical discussions, I focused on being the kind of leader whose example might inspire some toward virtue. This shift from wanting different circumstances to working effectively within existing circumstances liberated enormous amounts of mental energy. The energy I had been wasting on resentment could now be directed toward useful action. The time I had spent fantasizing about ideal scenarios could now be used for strategic planning within real constraints. The wooden cup served as my daily practice in this discipline. Every morning, as I drank water from this simple vessel, I reminded myself that my happiness was not dependent on external luxury. Every evening, as I cleaned the cup myself instead of handing it to servants, I practiced gratitude for having clean water to drink, something millions of my subjects lacked. This wasn't about rejecting all pleasure or comfort. I still lived in a palace, still enjoyed excellent food, still appreciated beautiful art and music, but I held these pleasures lightly, knowing that my peace of mind didn't depend on them. I could enjoy luxury when it was available and be content without it when it wasn't. The professional application of this principle is transformative. How much of your job satisfaction depends on external factors you can't control? Are you waiting for your boss to change before you can be engaged at work? Are you postponing career satisfaction until you get promoted? Are you telling yourself you'll be happy once your company implements better policies? This approach guarantees professional misery because it makes your well-being dependent on factors outside your influence. The discipline of desire means finding ways to be excellent within your current circumstances, rather than waiting for perfect circumstances to begin being excellent. I developed a practice I called luxury detox to strengthen this discipline. Periodically, I would voluntarily give up comforts I had grown accustomed to, sleeping on the floor instead of my soft bed, eating simple bread instead of elaborate meals, walking instead of riding in the imperial litter. These weren't acts of self-punishment, but exercises in mental freedom. When you voluntarily practice discomfort, you build confidence that you can handle involuntary discomfort. When you choose to do without luxuries temporarily, you prove to yourself that your happiness isn't dependent on those luxuries. This creates what I call emotional anti-fragility, the ability to not just survive setbacks, but to emerge stronger from them. In your career, this might mean occasionally working in less comfortable conditions to prove you can maintain excellence regardless of environment. It might mean practicing presentations without perfect technology to build confidence that you can perform well even when equipment fails. It might mean taking on challenging assignments that don't offer immediate rewards to develop skills that serve long-term goals. The most profound insight from practicing the discipline of desire was understanding the difference between needs and wants. I needed food, water, shelter, and meaningful work. Everything else was a want that I could enjoy when available, but didn't require for contentment. This distinction gave me enormous psychological freedom. When Germanic tribes threatened our borders, I didn't need them to be peaceful. I could work effectively with the reality of conflict. When senators opposed my policies, I didn't need their agreement. I could govern skillfully within political opposition. When plague struck Rome, I didn't need it to end quickly. I could lead competently through extended crisis. Your professional challenges become much more manageable when you stop needing them to be different. You don't need your boss to appreciate your work. You can maintain excellence regardless of recognition. You don't need your colleagues to be more competent. You can contribute effectively regardless of others' limitations. You don't need your industry to be more rational. You can make smart decisions within irrational systems. The wooden cup also taught me about the addictive nature of luxury. The more elaborate your lifestyle becomes, the more elaborate it needs to maintain the same level of satisfaction. This creates an endless cycle of escalating desires that can never be permanently satisfied. But when you cultivate appreciation for simple pleasures, you become capable of sustained contentment. I watched this principle destroy many wealthy Romans who could never have enough status, enough recognition, enough luxury, enough power. Despite having more than 99% of the population, they were chronically dissatisfied because their desires always expanded faster than their acquisitions. They were rich in possessions, but poor in peace. The discipline of desire doesn't mean eliminating all ambition or accepting mediocrity. It means pursuing goals from a place of strength rather than neediness. When you don't need external validation to feel worthy, you can take bigger risks because failure doesn't threaten your identity. When you don't need specific outcomes to be happy, you can work more creatively because you're not paralyzed by fear of disappointment. This creates a powerful paradox. The less you need external success, the more likely you are to achieve it. When your self-worth isn't riding on every presentation, you present with more confidence. When your identity isn't tied to a specific promotion, you interview more authentically. When your happiness doesn't depend on client approval, you serve clients more effectively because you're focused on their needs rather than your anxieties. The wooden cup sits beside me still as I write these words, a simple reminder that freedom comes not from having everything you want, but from wanting nothing more than what you have. In a world that profits from your dissatisfaction, this contentment is the most radical revolution you can stage. The daily schedule I maintained as emperor was carved into a wooden tablet that survived my reign, a precise record of how I structured each day to maximize useful action while maintaining philosophical equilibrium. Every hour was accounted for, not because I was obsessed with productivity, but because I understood that right action flows from clear intention and disciplined preparation. Most people approach their work reactively, responding to whatever demands the loudest attention or creates the most immediate pressure. But this reactive approach leads to a life spent perpetually in crisis mode, always fighting fires but never building anything lasting. The discipline of action taught me to be proactive rather than reactive, to work from purpose rather than from pressure. My daily routine began before dawn with what I called morning preparation. Before engaging with any external demands, before reading reports from provincial governors, before meeting with advisors, before addressing Senate concerns, I spent time clarifying my intentions for the day. I would ask myself, what kind of emperor do I want to be today? What values will guide my decisions? How can I serve the common good through today's choices? This wasn't empty ritual. This was strategic planning for character. Just as a general wouldn't enter battle without understanding the terrain and objectives, I wouldn't enter the day without understanding my moral terrain and ethical objectives. This preparation created what I call intentional momentum, energy directed toward worthy goals, rather than scattered across reactive responses. The parallel to your professional life is crucial. How often do you start your workday by immediately checking emails, responding to urgent requests, or diving into whatever task feels most pressing? This reactive approach means you're spending your best mental energy on other people's priorities rather than your own strategic objectives. I developed a practice of identifying 3 essential actions each day, 3 things that, if accomplished, would move important projects forward regardless of what other chaos emerged. These weren't always the most urgent items on my schedule, but they were always the most important for long-term success. Everything else was secondary to these 3 priorities. During the Germanic campaigns, this discipline proved invaluable. Military life is inherently chaotic. Intelligence reports change. Weather disrupts plans. Enemy actions require immediate responses. But underneath this tactical chaos, I maintained strategic consistency by ensuring that every day's actions served our larger objectives, even when specific plans had to be abandoned. The key insight was learning to separate motion from progress. Motion is being busy, responding to demands, staying active. Progress is moving toward meaningful objectives through deliberate action. Many of my advisors were constantly in motion, attending meetings, writing reports, engaging in political maneuvering, but they weren't necessarily making progress toward goals that mattered. I instituted what I called action audits every evening, reviewing the day's decisions and activities to assess whether they had served important purposes or just filled time. This practice revealed how much energy I was wasting on activities that felt important but didn't actually advance meaningful objectives. The discipline of action also required me to accept that I couldn't control outcomes, only the quality of my efforts. This was perhaps the most difficult aspect for someone in a position of supreme authority. When provincial rebellions erupted, when natural disasters struck, when diplomatic negotiations failed, my initial instinct was to blame myself for not producing better results. but I learned to evaluate my leadership based on the wisdom of my decisions given the information available, not on whether those decisions produced desired outcomes. Sometimes right action leads to difficult consequences, and sometimes wrong action produces favorable results in the short term. The discipline is to maintain the highest standards for your decision-making process while releasing attachment to specific results. This principle transformed how I approached complex policy decisions. When facing economic challenges that threatened Roman stability, I could focus entirely on developing the most thoughtful response possible rather than guaranteeing that response would solve every problem. When managing political conflicts that had no perfect solutions, I could choose the path that best honored my values rather than the path most likely to please everyone. Your professional life becomes infinitely more manageable when you adopt the same approach. Instead of being paralyzed by fear of failure or driven by need for specific outcomes, you can focus your energy on doing excellent work and let the results take care of themselves. This doesn't mean being indifferent to results. It means not letting anxiety about results compromise the quality of your efforts. I also discovered the importance of what I called sustainable intensity. Many leaders burn themselves out by treating every task as equally urgent, every decision as life or death, every setback as catastrophic. But this approach is neither sustainable nor effective. It leads to decision fatigue, emotional exhaustion, and poor judgment when genuine crises arise. Instead, I learned to calibrate my intensity to match the actual importance of each situation. Routine administrative decisions received competent attention, but not intense focus. Critical military or policy decisions received my full mental resources. Personal attacks or political criticism received minimal emotional energy because responding defensively rarely served useful purposes. This calibration required constant practice in distinguishing between what seemed urgent and what was actually important. Urgent items demand immediate attention but may not significantly impact long-term objectives. Important items advance meaningful goals but may not require immediate action. The discipline of action means consistently prioritizing important work over urgent distractions. During Senate sessions, I would often watch colleagues exhaust themselves responding to every criticism, defending every minor decision, engaging with every political provocation. Their days were consumed by reactive responses to other people's agendas rather than proactive advancement of their own objectives. They were working hard, but not working strategically. I developed a simple filter for deciding which issues deserved my attention and which could be safely ignored. Does this matter for the people I serve? Will engaging with this advance important objectives? Is this the best use of my limited time and energy today? Most political drama failed this test and was therefore ignored. The discipline of action ultimately taught me that true productivity comes not from doing more things, but from doing the right things consistently well. It's better to complete 3 important tasks excellently than to handle 15 urgent tasks poorly. It's better to make progress on meaningful projects than to stay busy with activities that don't serve larger purposes. Every evening, as I reviewed my daily schedule tablet, I would ask myself whether the emperor I had been that day was worthy of the trust placed in me, not whether I had accomplished everything I hoped, not whether every decision had produced ideal results, but whether my actions had been guided by wisdom, integrity, and service to the common good. This daily practice of honest self-evaluation kept me accountable to my highest standards while maintaining realistic expectations about what any single day could accomplish. It taught me that discipline isn't about perfection. It's about consistency in pursuing excellence, even when excellence is difficult to achieve. The wooden tablet reminds me that every day is an opportunity to practice right action, to choose purpose over pressure, to serve important goals rather than urgent distractions. Your daily choices, accumulated over time, become your character. Your character, expressed through consistent action, becomes your legacy. The polished bronze mirror that served as my tool for daily self-examination was more than a simple-looking glass. It was my gateway to the most powerful discovery of my reign. In that reflective surface, I learned to see not just my physical appearance, but the thoughts and judgments that shaped my entire experience of reality. The discipline of assent taught me that between any event and my emotional response to that event lies a moment of choice that most people never recognize. Every morning, I would look into that mirror and ask myself a question that would determine the quality of my entire day. What story am I telling myself about what happened yesterday? And is that story serving my ability to lead effectively today? This simple practice revealed something profound. We don't respond to events themselves, but to our interpretations of those events. And those interpretations are entirely within our control. Let me share a specific example that illustrates this principle. During my second year as emperor, a senator named Cassius launched a rebellion in Syria, declaring himself the rightful ruler and attempting to win over several eastern legions. When the news reached Rome, my immediate judgment was, this is a personal betrayal by someone I trusted. This threatens everything I've worked to build. This proves that people are fundamentally ungrateful and disloyal. But as I stood before my bronze mirror that morning, I recognized these judgments for what they were, stories I was telling myself about neutral facts. The neutral facts were simple. A provincial governor had declared independence and was attempting to establish military support for his claim. My emotional story about betrayal, ingratitude, and threat was an addition I was making to those facts. This recognition created what I came to call the pause, a space between stimulus and response, where conscious choice becomes possible. Instead of reacting from anger, hurt pride, or fear, I could choose my response based on what would best serve the empire's stability and the people's welfare. I reframed the situation. Cassius's rebellion was providing valuable information about weaknesses in our system of provincial governance. It was creating an opportunity to demonstrate how legitimate authority responds to illegitimate challenges. It was offering a chance to strengthen loyalty among legions that remained faithful by showing them their loyalty was valued and rewarded. This shift in interpretation completely changed my emotional state and strategic response. Instead of being consumed by anger and rushing to crush the rebellion through maximum force, I could develop a measured response that addressed the underlying issues while minimizing bloodshed and disruption to civilian populations. The discipline of assent isn't about denying reality or pretending negative events are positive. It's about recognizing that your interpretation of events is separate from the events themselves, and that you can choose interpretations that serve your effectiveness rather than just expressing your emotions. In your professional life, this principle is transformative. When a client rejects your proposal, the neutral fact is that they've chosen a different option. Your judgment that this rejection means you're incompetent, that the client doesn't appreciate quality work, or that your industry is becoming impossible to succeed in. These are stories you're adding to the neutral fact. And those stories determine whether you respond with improved strategy or with discouragement and resentment. I developed a daily practice of catching my automatic judgments and examining them for usefulness. When provincial governors submitted reports that contradicted my expectations, my automatic judgment might be, these people don't understand what I'm trying to accomplish. But I learned to pause and ask, is this judgment helping me govern more effectively, or is it just protecting my ego from information I don't want to accept? Often the most useful response was to revise my judgment. These reports contain information I didn't previously have. They represent perspectives from people who understand local conditions better than I do. They're offering me opportunities to improve policies that aren't working as intended. This shift in judgment opened my mind to learning rather than closing it off in defensiveness. The bronze mirror showed me that most of our professional suffering comes not from challenging circumstances, but from our resistance to those circumstances. When you judge a difficult colleague as impossible to work with, you create ongoing frustration every time you interact with them. When you judge a demanding project as unreasonable, you generate resentment that undermines your ability to perform well on that project. But when you accept difficult colleagues as opportunities to practice patience and challenging projects as chances to develop new capabilities, the same external circumstances become sources of growth rather than sources of stress. The circumstances haven't changed, only your judgment about them has shifted. This doesn't mean accepting genuinely harmful situations or failing to work toward positive change. It means approaching challenges from a position of strength rather than victimhood. When you see yourself as someone who can handle difficult people, unreasonable deadlines, and imperfect systems, you become someone who can actually handle these things effectively. I remember a particularly challenging period when several crises converged simultaneously. Germanic tribes were pressing our northern borders, a severe food shortage was affecting major cities, and political opponents were using these difficulties to question my leadership competence. My initial judgments created a narrative of overwhelming crisis and personal failure, but the mirror forced me to examine these judgments. Were these problems evidence that I was failing as an emperor, or were they simply the kinds of challenges that all leaders face? Was this convergence of difficulties proof that the empire was doomed, or was it an opportunity to demonstrate resilience and competent crisis management? I chose to reframe the situation. Multiple simultaneous challenges were providing a chance to develop integrated solutions that addressed underlying systemic issues. They were creating opportunities for different parts of the government to coordinate more effectively. They were offering chances to demonstrate that Roman civilization could adapt and thrive under pressure. This shift in judgment transformed my energy from defensive anxiety to strategic engagement. Instead of being overwhelmed by the magnitude of problems, I became focused on the opportunities they presented for systematic improvement. The discipline of assent taught me to distinguish between facts and interpretations, between what happens and what I make those happenings mean. Facts are neutral and must be accepted. Interpretations are chosen and can be revised to serve your effectiveness rather than just your emotional habits. When market conditions change in your industry, the fact of change must be accepted, but whether you interpret that change as threat or opportunity determines whether you respond with innovation or desperation. When organizational restructuring affects your role, the fact of change is neutral, but whether you judge it as evidence of your declining value or as a chance to demonstrate adaptability determines whether you navigate the transition successfully. The bronze mirror also revealed how much mental energy I was wasting on judgments that served no useful purpose. Judging other people as lazy, incompetent, or malicious might feel satisfying in the moment, but it doesn't improve their performance or your ability to work with them effectively. Judging circumstances as unfair or unreasonable might validate your frustration, but it doesn't change those circumstances or help you navigate them skillfully. I learned to ask myself, is this judgment moving me toward a solution, or is it just making me feel better temporarily? Useful judgments generate effective action. Useless judgments just generate emotional drama that consumes energy without producing results. The most profound insight from this practice was understanding that emotional freedom comes not from controlling external events, but from controlling your interpretations of those events. When you master the discipline of assent, you become immune to manipulation through circumstances. Your peace of mind depends on your wisdom, not on whether things go according to your preferences. The bronze mirror still reflects back this truth. Between every event and your emotional response lies a moment of choice. In that moment, you can choose judgments that serve your highest self, or judgments that serve your lowest impulses. The quality of your life, professional and personal, depends entirely on which choice you make, moment by moment, day after day. The funeral mask of Antoninus Pius sat on a shelf in my private study throughout my reign, its bronze features frozen in the eternal stillness that awaits us all. Each morning as I began my daily preparations, I would look upon that mask and remember that the man who had been my adoptive father, my mentor, and one of the wisest rulers in Roman history was now nothing more than memory and influence. This daily confrontation with mortality became my most powerful teacher in the art of living. Most people spend enormous energy avoiding thoughts of death, as if ignoring mortality could somehow postpone it indefinitely. But I discovered that regular contemplation of death is the surest path to clarity about life. When you truly accept that your time is limited, you stop wasting it on activities that don't matter. When you genuinely understand that your career, your accomplishments, even your reputation are temporary, you start focusing on what might actually endure. The funeral mask taught me to ask myself daily, if I were to die tonight, would I be proud of how I spent today? This wasn't meant to create morbid anxiety, but to generate what I call mortal urgency, a healthy pressure to use time wisely, because time is the one resource that can never be replenished. During my early years as emperor, I often postponed difficult conversations, delayed important decisions, and put off meaningful actions because I assumed I would have unlimited opportunities to address these matters later. The presence of Antoninus's death mask cured me of this dangerous assumption. Every day became precious because every day was irreplaceable. I began structuring my time around a simple question. What would I regret not doing if I knew this was my final year of life? The answers were illuminating. I wouldn't regret missing some meetings or failing to respond to every political criticism, but I would regret not spending enough time developing wisdom, not investing in relationships that mattered, not creating systems that would serve people long after my death. This perspective transformed how I approached my professional responsibilities. Instead of trying to control every detail of imperial administration, I focused on building institutions and training people who could maintain good governance without depending on my personal oversight. Instead of micromanaging every decision, I concentrated on establishing principles that could guide future decisions when I was no longer available to make them. The lesson for your career is profound. You can spend your professional life building monuments to your own importance, or you can spend it building systems and developing people that will create value long after you've moved on. One approach serves your ego. The other serves your legacy. One creates temporary achievements. The other creates lasting impact. I remember a conversation with a senator who was agonizing over whether to support a policy that would benefit future generations, but might cost him political support in the upcoming election. He kept asking what the short-term political implications would be, what his donors would think, how it might affect his chances for re-election. Finally, I asked him, if you knew you would die tomorrow, would you vote for this policy? His answer came immediately. Of course, it's clearly the right thing to do. The contemplation of mortality cut through all his political calculations and revealed his authentic judgment. Your own professional decisions become much clearer when viewed through the lens of mortality. When you're considering whether to take a job that pays more but requires you to compromise your values, ask yourself, on my deathbed, will I be glad I chose money over integrity? When you're deciding whether to have a difficult conversation with a colleague who's undermining team effectiveness, ask yourself, if I died without addressing this issue, would I regret the consequences of my avoidance? The funeral mask also taught me about the liberation that comes from accepting death as natural and inevitable. When you're no longer fighting against the reality of mortality, you stop trying to achieve immortality through your work. This removes an enormous amount of pressure and anxiety from professional life. Many people exhaust themselves trying to build careers that will make them permanently important, permanently remembered, permanently secure. But security is an illusion. Importance is temporary, and most of us will be forgotten within a generation or two, regardless of our achievements. Once you accept these facts, you can focus on creating value rather than pursuing permanence. I developed a practice called deathbed perspective for evaluating major decisions. Before committing to any significant project or policy, I would imagine myself, near death, looking back on that decision. Would I be glad I invested my limited time and energy in this direction? Would this choice serve something larger than my own ambition? Would the results justify the opportunity cost of not pursuing other options? This practice eliminated many activities that seemed important in the moment but wouldn't matter from the perspective of a complete life. It also highlighted opportunities I might have missed if I had focused only on immediate concerns rather than long-term significance. During the plague years, when death was visible everywhere and life felt especially fragile, this contemplation of mortality became even more practical. I watched how different people responded to the proximity of death. Some became paralyzed by fear, unable to function effectively because they were so focused on avoiding infection. Others became reckless, abandoning all responsibility because they assumed they were doomed anyway. But a few used the awareness of death as motivation for excellence. They worked with greater focus because they knew their time might be short. They treated people with more kindness because they understood how precious and brief every human connection is. They made decisions with more courage because the fear of death paled in comparison to the fear of wasting whatever life remained. The most powerful insight from contemplating mortality was understanding that death gives meaning to life by creating scarcity. If you had infinite time, no decision would matter because you could always try every option eventually. Because time is limited, your choices carry weight. Because life is finite, your decisions about how to spend it determine who you become. This understanding changed how I approached difficult periods in my reign. When facing seemingly insurmountable challenges, I would remind myself that this struggle was temporary. Either I would solve the problem or I would die trying, but either way, the difficulty wouldn't last forever. This wasn't fatalism, it was perspective that allowed me to act courageously without being paralyzed by the magnitude of challenges. Your own professional struggles become more manageable when viewed against the backdrop of mortality. The project that's consuming all your mental energy is temporary. The difficult boss who's making your work life miserable is temporary. The industry changes that seem overwhelming are temporary. You are temporary too, which means you don't have to solve every problem or endure every difficulty forever. But mortality also creates urgency about what does matter. If your time at this company is limited, how do you want to spend it? If your career is finite, what impact do you want to have? If your influence on colleagues and clients is temporary, how do you want to use that influence while you have it? The funeral mask of Antoninus Pius reminds me daily that death is not the opposite of life. It's the force that gives life direction and meaning. When you accept your mortality fully, you stop postponing important actions and start living with the intensity that comes from knowing your time matters because your time is limited. The awareness of death doesn't diminish life. It concentrates it into something powerful and purposeful. The beggar's cloak that hung in my wardrobe was perhaps the most valuable garment I owned, though it was worth less than a single denarius. Woven from the coarsest wool and patched in multiple places, this simple cloak served as my training ground for one of the most powerful Stoic practices, negative visualization. Several times each year, I would wear this cloak instead of imperial purple, eat simple bread instead of elaborate meals, and sleep on a hard floor instead of my comfortable bed. These weren't acts of self-punishment or displays of false humility. They were deliberate exercises in mental preparation for the inevitable reversals that life brings to everyone, including emperors. By voluntarily experiencing discomfort and loss, I was training my mind to handle involuntary hardships with grace, rather than being destroyed by them. The practice began during my philosophical training under Junius Rusticus, who taught me that the mind, like the body, grows stronger through deliberate stress. Just as soldiers train in harsh conditions so they can fight effectively in actual battles, we must train our minds to handle loss so we can respond wisely when real losses occur. Most people wait until disaster strikes to discover whether they have the resilience to handle it. By then, it's too late to develop the mental skills they need. Negative visualization allows you to build psychological strength during good times so you're prepared for difficult times. It's like purchasing insurance for your peace of mind. I would begin each visualization session by imagining the complete loss of everything I valued most. What if barbarian invasions destroyed Rome itself? What if plague claimed everyone I loved? What if political enemies stripped me of all authority and sentenced me to exile? What if everything I had worked to build crumbled into dust during my lifetime? The initial response to these mental experiments was exactly what you'd expect: anxiety, sadness, and resistance. But as I continued the practice, something remarkable happened. I began to see how I could maintain my core self, even in the face of complete external destruction. I realized that my capacity for wisdom, courage, and virtue didn't depend on my circumstances remaining stable. This insight was profoundly liberating. If I could be a good person while living as a beggar, then my goodness wasn't dependent on being emperor. If I could find meaning while stripped of all possessions, then my sense of purpose wasn't dependent on luxury. If I could maintain my philosophical principles while facing total defeat, then my identity wasn't dependent on success. The practice also revealed how much energy I had been unconsciously spending on protecting and maintaining my external circumstances. When you accept that everything you have can be lost, you stop expending mental resources on anxiety about losing it. This frees enormous amounts of psychological energy that can be redirected toward useful activities. During the Germanic Wars, negative visualization proved its practical value repeatedly. Before each major battle, I would spend time imagining total military defeat. Our legions destroyed, our positions overrun, our strategic objectives completely failed. This wasn't pessimism, it was preparation. By mentally rehearsing worst-case scenarios, I could develop contingency plans that wouldn't have occurred to me if I had focused only on optimistic outcomes. More importantly, I could enter battles with a calm mind because I had already accepted that defeat was possible and survivable. This paradoxically increased my chances of success because I could make strategic decisions without being paralyzed by fear of failure. The application to your professional life is immediate and powerful. How much mental energy are you spending on worry about things that might never happen? How much anxiety are you carrying about potential losses that you can't prevent? How much of your attention is consumed by protecting what you have rather than building what you want? Negative visualization can free you from these drains on your psychological resources. Spend time deliberately imagining the loss of your current job. What would you do? How would you survive? What opportunities might emerge from that apparent disaster? When you realize you could handle unemployment, you stop being controlled by the fear of unemployment. This makes you more effective in your current role because you're working from confidence rather than desperation. I developed a systematic approach to this practice. Once each month, I would choose a different category of potential loss and spend several days contemplating it thoroughly. One month, I might focus on the loss of health, imagining how I would lead the empire while dealing with serious illness or disability. Another month, I might contemplate the loss of trusted advisors, considering how I would govern without the people I most relied upon. Each visualization session followed the same pattern. First, I would imagine the loss as vividly as possible, allowing myself to feel the initial emotional impact. Then I would work through practical questions. How would I respond? What resources would remain available? What opportunities might emerge from this apparent catastrophe? Finally, I would identify specific actions I could take immediately to prepare for this possibility or reduce its likelihood. This process transformed abstract fears into concrete plans. Instead of carrying vague anxiety about potential problems, I developed specific strategies for handling actual challenges. Instead of feeling helpless in the face of uncertain futures, I built confidence through preparation. The beggar's cloak also taught me about the difference between losing things and losing the fear of losing things. When I wore that rough garment and slept on hard floors, I wasn't actually losing my imperial luxuries. They were still available when I chose to return to them. But I was losing my attachment to those luxuries, my unconscious assumption that my well-being depended on them. This distinction is crucial for professional development. You don't need to actually lose your job to benefit from imagining unemployment. You don't need to actually fail a major project to gain strength from visualizing failure. The mental rehearsal alone builds resilience and reduces the emotional charge around potential setbacks. Over time, negative visualization created what I call preferential detachment. I could still prefer comfort to discomfort, success to failure, health to illness, but I wasn't dependent on getting my preferences. I could work toward positive outcomes while remaining at peace if negative outcomes occurred. This gave me enormous strategic flexibility because I could take risks that would have paralyzed someone who couldn't tolerate the possibility of failure. During the plague years, this training proved invaluable. While others were consumed by anxiety about infection and death, I could focus on governance and relief efforts because I had already accepted the possibility of my own death. While others were paralyzed by the uncertainty of how long the crisis would last, I could make long-term plans because I had mentally rehearsed extending operations indefinitely under difficult conditions. The most profound benefit of negative visualizations was discovering that most feared outcomes, when examined carefully, aren't actually catastrophic. The loss that seems like it would destroy your life often turns out to be manageable, sometimes even beneficial. The failure that appears to threaten your identity often opens doors to better opportunities. The setback that feels overwhelming often teaches lessons that accelerate your development. Remember a specific visualization where I imagined losing the respect of the Roman people entirely, being seen as an ineffective emperor who had failed in his duties. Initially, this scenario filled me with dread, but as I explored it more deeply, I realized that even this apparent catastrophe wouldn't destroy what mattered most about my life. I could still practice virtue, still seek wisdom, still contribute to human welfare, even without public approval. This realization freed me from the exhausting need to manage my reputation and allowed me to focus entirely on doing what I believed was right. When you're not afraid of being criticized, you can make unpopular decisions that serve long-term interests. When you're not terrified of failure, you can attempt ambitious projects that might transform everything. The beggar's cloak hangs in my wardrobe still, a reminder that the willingness to lose everything is the foundation of true fearlessness. When you have nothing left to protect, you have everything left to give. When you're not afraid of falling, you can climb to heights that would terrify those still worried about the distance to the ground. The simple stone that sat on my desk was unremarkable in every way. Gray granite, roughly the size of my palm, with no precious metals or gems embedded in its surface. To any visitor, it appeared to be nothing more than a paperweight. But this ordinary stone represented the most revolutionary idea I ever encountered, that virtue is the only true good, and everything else, wealth, power, reputation, even health, is merely indifferent. This concept challenged everything I had been taught about value and success. Roman society, like most civilizations, operated on the assumption that external goods determined human worth. Senators competed for wealth and status. Citizens measured success through possessions and position. Even philosophers often sought recognition and reward for their wisdom. But the Stoics taught me that all these external pursuits were ultimately meaningless distractions from the only thing that actually matters, the quality of your character. The stone came from my garden during a moment of profound realization. I had spent the morning dealing with reports of grain shortages, territorial disputes, and political intrigue, the typical chaos of imperial administration. Despite having absolute power and unlimited resources, I felt deeply frustrated by my inability to solve every problem immediately and perfectly. As I walked through my private garden seeking clarity, I noticed this unremarkable stone lying among more decorative elements. In that moment, I understood something that transformed my entire approach to leadership. This plain stone was completely content being exactly what it was. It didn't aspire to be marble or gold. It didn't suffer from comparison to more beautiful objects. It simply existed with perfect integrity to its nature. The parallel to human life was profound. What if I could find that same contentment in being exactly who I was, regardless of external circumstances? What if my worth wasn't determined by how well my policies worked or how history would judge my reign, but by whether I was living according to my highest principles? What if success meant maintaining virtue rather than achieving specific outcomes? This shift in perspective liberated me from the exhausting cycle of external validation that traps most people in positions of authority. I stopped measuring my worth as emperor by whether every decision produced ideal results and started measuring it by whether every decision reflected wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, the four cardinal virtues that form the foundation of Stoic ethics. Wisdom meant making decisions based on the best available information rather than on what would be most popular or politically advantageous. Justice meant considering the impact of policies on all citizens, not just those with influence and wealth. Courage meant doing what was right, even when it was difficult or dangerous. Temperance meant maintaining self-discipline and moderation, even when unlimited power made excess possible. These virtues became my compass for navigating every challenge. When facing difficult diplomatic negotiations, I asked myself, what response would demonstrate wisdom? When allocating limited resources during times of scarcity, I asked, what distribution would serve justice? When confronting military threats or political opposition, I asked, how can I respond with courage? When tempted by the luxuries and privileges of imperial office, I asked, what choice would reflect temperance? The remarkable discovery was that focusing on virtue rather than outcomes actually improved my effectiveness as a leader. When you're not anxiously attached to specific results, you can think more clearly about what actions are most likely to produce good results. When you're not defending your ego, you can accept feedback and adapt your strategies based on new information. When you're not trying to control everything, you can focus your energy on what you can actually influence. This principle applies directly to your professional development. Most career advice focuses on external achievements. Get the promotion, increase your salary, build your network, enhance your reputation. But these external goods are largely outside your control and can be lost through circumstances beyond your influence. An economic recession can eliminate your job. Industry changes can make your skills obsolete. Company politics can undermine your reputation despite excellent performance. But your commitment to virtue, to doing excellent work regardless of recognition, to treating colleagues with respect regardless of how they treat you, to maintaining integrity regardless of whether it's rewarded, cannot be taken away by external circumstances. This creates what I call anti-fragile self-worth, confidence that grows stronger under pressure rather than being destroyed by setbacks. I developed a daily practice of virtue evaluation, examining my decisions and actions through the lens of the four cardinal virtues. Each evening, I would review the day and ask, did my choices reflect wisdom, or did I act from ignorance or prejudice? Did my decisions serve justice, or did I favor some people unfairly? Did I respond to challenges with courage, or did I avoid necessary difficulties? Did I maintain temperance, or did I indulge in excess? This practice revealed patterns I wouldn't have noticed otherwise. I discovered that my biggest leadership failures came not from lack of intelligence or resources, but from moments when I had compromised one of the cardinal virtues. Poor decisions usually resulted from choosing expedience over wisdom, favoritism over justice, comfort over courage, or excess over temperance. The stone reminded me daily that virtue is internal and therefore completely within my control. External circumstances might limit my options for action, but they could never force me to abandon wisdom, justice, courage, or temperance. Even if I were stripped of all imperial power and reduced to poverty, I could still choose to respond to that situation with virtue. This understanding transformed how I handled criticism and political opposition. When senators attacked my policies or citizens complained about my decisions, my initial impulse was often defensive, to justify my choices, to counterattack my critics, or to use imperial power to silence opposition. But the stone reminded me that my worth wasn't dependent on others' approval. Instead, I could ask, is there wisdom in this criticism that I should consider? How can I respond in a way that serves justice rather than just protecting my ego? What would courage look like? In this situation, how can I maintain temperance rather than reacting emotionally? This approach didn't eliminate conflict, but it transformed conflict from personal attacks on my identity into opportunities to practice virtue. Critics became teachers, helping me identify blind spots or areas for improvement. Opposition became training ground for developing patience and understanding. Setbacks became chances to demonstrate resilience and grace under pressure. The most profound insight from focusing on virtue was understanding that it creates its own rewards. When you consistently act with wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, you build unshakable self-respect that no external failure can destroy. You develop trust in your own decision-making ability that enables confident action, even in uncertain situations. You create inner peace that remains stable, regardless of external chaos. These internal rewards are more valuable than any external achievement because they cannot be lost through circumstances beyond your control. A competitor can steal your clients, but they cannot steal your integrity. Economic conditions can reduce your income, but they cannot reduce your commitment to excellence. Industry changes can make your current skills obsolete, but they cannot make virtue obsolete. During the Germanic Wars, this focus on virtue sustained me through months of difficult decisions with unclear outcomes. I couldn't control whether my military strategies would succeed or whether diplomatic negotiations would prevent future conflicts, but I could control whether my decisions reflected careful thought, fair consideration of all options, brave acceptance of necessary risks, and disciplined use of imperial resources. This created what I call process confidence, trust in my ability to make good decisions regardless of whether those decisions produced desired results. When you know you're consistently choosing virtue over convenience, you can act decisively even when outcomes are uncertain. You can take necessary risks without being paralyzed by fear of failure because your self-worth isn't dependent on always being right. The gray stone sits on my desk still, an unremarkable reminder of the most remarkable truth I've discovered, that everything the world values most highly, wealth, power, status, recognition, is ultimately worthless compared to the simple practice of living according to virtue. External goods can enhance your ability to serve others, but they cannot enhance your fundamental worth as a human being. That worth is determined entirely by your character, and your character is entirely within your control. The citizenship scroll that extended Roman rights throughout the empire bears my seal, but it represents a principle that extends far beyond legal documents, that we are all members of a larger human community, and our individual virtue must serve collective flourishing. This scroll reminds me daily that Stoicism isn't a philosophy of selfish detachment, but a framework for serving others more effectively by first mastering yourself. Many people misunderstand Stoic philosophy as encouraging emotional withdrawal from the world's problems. They imagine the ideal Stoic as someone who remains calm by simply not caring about others' suffering or society's challenges. But this interpretation misses the core of Stoic ethics. We develop inner strength precisely so we can serve the common good more effectively. When I first began practicing Stoic disciplines, I made this same mistake. I thought that achieving personal tranquility was the ultimate goal, that maintaining my own peace of mind was more important than engaging with the messy realities of leadership. I spent time in philosophical contemplation while postponing difficult decisions that affected millions of people's lives. But my teachers, particularly Junius Rusticus, helped me understand that personal virtue without social contribution is incomplete virtue. The disciplines of desire, action, and assent aren't meant to create detachment from human community. They're meant to enable more skillful engagement with that community. The citizenship scroll taught me that extending rights and opportunities to others isn't just good policy, it's good philosophy. When we recognize that all human beings share the capacity for reason and virtue, we understand that expanding others' opportunities to develop these capacities serves everyone's interests. A community where more people can flourish is a community where everyone benefits from increased wisdom, productivity, and cooperation. This principle transformed how I approached the tensions between personal Stoic practice and public leadership. Responsibilities. Instead of seeing these as competing demands, I began to understand them as mutually reinforcing. My daily philosophical practices made me a more effective leader, and my leadership responsibilities provided opportunities to practice virtue in concrete, meaningful ways. The balance required constant attention. During the plague years, I had to maintain my own emotional equilibrium while organizing massive relief efforts that consumed enormous resources and energy. If I had focused only on my personal tranquility, I would have failed in my duty to serve the people during crisis. If I had focused only on external action without maintaining inner discipline, I would have burned out and become ineffective. The key insight was understanding that serving others effectively requires maintaining your own strength and clarity. You cannot give what you don't have. If you're emotionally reactive, anxious, or overwhelmed, you're more likely to make poor decisions that hurt the people you're trying to help. But if you're centered, wise, and resilient, you can respond to others' needs from a place of strength rather than weakness. This applies directly to your professional leadership challenges. Whether you're managing a team of 5 or leading an organization of thousands, your ability to serve others depends on your ability to manage yourself. When you're controlled by ego, fear, or reactivity, you make decisions based on your emotional needs rather than what's best for the people you lead. I developed what I called concentric circles of concern to guide my decision-making. The innermost circle contained my own character development, maintaining virtue and philosophical discipline. The next circle included my family and closest advisors, those whose welfare was directly connected to mine. The third circle encompassed the Romans, people, those I was specifically charged to serve. The outermost circle included all human beings, the broader community to which we all belong. The crucial understanding was that serving the outer circles effectively required maintaining the inner circles properly. I couldn't serve the empire well if I neglected my own character development. I couldn't lead the Roman people effectively if I ignored the counsel of trusted advisors. But I also couldn't justify focusing only on inner circles while ignoring my responsibilities to the broader community. This framework helped me navigate countless situations where personal preferences conflicted with public duties. During the Germanic campaigns, I would have preferred to remain in Rome studying philosophy and enjoying the comforts of imperial life. But my responsibility to protect Roman citizens required accepting the hardships of military leadership. The Stoic disciplines didn't eliminate this conflict. They helped me fulfill difficult duties without resentment or self-pity. The Citizenship Scroll also reminds me of the Stoic teaching that we are naturally social beings, designed for cooperation and mutual support. Our individual flourishing is ultimately inseparable from our community's flourishing. This isn't merely idealistic philosophy, it's practical wisdom that recognizes how interconnected our interests actually are. In your professional context, this means understanding that your success is connected to your colleagues' success, that your company's health affects your own opportunities, that your industry's reputation influences your career prospects. You can pursue individual advancement in ways that strengthen these larger systems or in ways that weaken them. The Stoic approach is to choose strategies that serve both your own development and your community's welfare. I learned this lesson powerfully during a severe economic crisis that threatened Roman financial stability. My initial instinct was to focus on preserving imperial resources and protecting the central government's solvency. But the Citizenship Scroll reminded me that the empire's health depended on its citizens' prosperity. Policies that protected government finances while devastating local economies would ultimately undermine the very foundation of imperial power. Instead, I implemented relief measures that temporarily reduced imperial revenue but helped maintain economic activity throughout the provinces. This required accepting short-term personal political risk to serve long-term collective interests. The Stoic disciplines gave me the courage to make unpopular decisions that I believed were right, and the emotional resilience to handle criticism from those who favored more conservative approaches. The most challenging aspect of balancing personal philosophy with social leadership was maintaining compassion without being overwhelmed by others' suffering. During the plague, I was constantly exposed to stories of families destroyed by disease, communities devastated by loss, and individuals facing circumstances beyond their control. My natural empathy wanted to feel every person's pain as if it were my own, but I discovered that taking on others' emotional suffering actually reduced my ability to help them. When I was consumed by grief for plague victims, I couldn't think clearly about resource allocation or policy responses. When I was overwhelmed by anger at the disease's unfairness, I couldn't maintain the calm leadership that crisis situations require. The Stoic approach taught me to maintain what I call compassionate detachment, deep care for others' welfare. Combined with emotional equilibrium that enables effective action, I could work tirelessly to reduce suffering without being destroyed by the reality that some suffering was beyond my power to prevent. This principle applies to every leadership situation you'll face. You can care deeply about your team's success without being devastated when some team members struggle. You can work hard to improve your organization's culture without being crushed when some aspects of that culture resist change. You can commit fully to your company's mission without having your identity destroyed if that company fails. The Citizenship Scroll taught me that true leadership means expanding the circle of people whose welfare you consider when making decisions. It means asking not just what serves my interests, but what serves the interests of everyone affected by this choice. It means recognizing that your individual excellence is valuable primarily because it enables you to contribute to collective flourishing. This doesn't mean sacrificing your own development or ignoring your personal needs. It means understanding that your highest personal development naturally leads to greater service to others, and that serving others effectively requires maintaining your own strength and wisdom. The goal isn't to lose yourself in service to others, but to find yourself through service that expresses your deepest values and capabilities. The scroll sits in my study as a permanent reminder that Stoic virtue is ultimately social virtue, character, strength developed not for its own sake, but for the sake of contributing to a world where more people can flourish. Your individual practice of wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance ripples outward to benefit everyone whose life you touch, creating circles of positive influence that extend far beyond anything you can directly control or even observe. The ornate dagger that sits locked in my private vault was a gift from Senator Avidius Cassius during what appeared to be a gesture of loyalty and friendship. Months later, this same man would declare himself emperor and launch a rebellion that threatened to tear the empire apart. The blade now serves as my daily reminder of the most challenging aspect of leadership, dealing with people whose actions seem to betray everything you stand for while maintaining your own virtue in the process. When I first learned of Cassius's rebellion, my immediate emotional response was devastation. This wasn't just political opposition. It felt like personal betrayal by someone I had trusted, promoted, and considered a friend. I had appointed him to key positions, supported his career advancement, and included him in confidential strategic discussions. His declaration of independence struck me as evidence that people are fundamentally unreliable and that trust in leadership is naive. But as I held his dagger and reflected on my Stoic training, I realized that my sense of betrayal was based on expectations that were unrealistic and ultimately harmful to my effectiveness as a leader. I had expected Cassius to prioritize loyalty to me over his own ambitions and judgments. I had expected him to share my vision of what was best for the empire. I had expected him to remain grateful for past favors rather than pursuing what he believed were better opportunities. These expectations were the source of my suffering, not Cassius's actions themselves. The Stoic discipline taught me that other people's choices reflect their character and circumstances, not mine. I could control my decisions about whom to trust and how much authority to delegate, but I could not control how others would use the trust and authority I gave them. This insight transformed how I approached every difficult relationship that followed. Instead of being constantly disappointed by others' failures to meet my expectations, I began accepting that people would act according to their own nature, training, and incentives. My job was to work skillfully with human nature as it actually exists, not as I wished it would be. The practical application was immediate. Rather than wasting energy on anger about Cassius's rebellion, I could focus on strategic responses that served the empire's stability. Rather than being paralyzed by questioning every other advisor's loyalty, I could develop better systems for monitoring and managing the risks that come with delegating authority. I developed what I call the difficult-to-person framework for handling challenging relationships without losing my own peace of mind. The framework begins with a fundamental Stoic principle. Other people's actions tell you about their character, not about your worth. When someone treats you badly, lies to you, or fails to meet their commitments, this reveals information about their reliability, integrity, and competence. It doesn't reveal anything negative about your value as a human being. This distinction is crucial for professional effectiveness. When a colleague undermines your project, a client rejects your proposal, or a boss fails to recognize your contributions, your initial interpretation might be that you're inadequate or that you've somehow failed. But the Stoic approach is to see these situations as information about external circumstances and other people's choices, not as judgments about your fundamental worth. The second element of the framework is understanding that difficult people are often struggling with their own internal challenges. Cassius's rebellion, when I examined it objectively, probably reflected his genuine belief that he could govern better than I could, combined with ambition and perhaps pressure from supporters who convinced him that rebellion was his duty to Rome. This didn't excuse his actions, but it helped me respond strategically rather than emotionally. When you understand that difficult behavior usually stems from fear, insecurity, incomplete information, or conflicting pressures, you can respond more skillfully. The colleague who takes credit for your work might be struggling with imposter syndrome and desperately trying to prove their value. The boss who micromanages might be under pressure from their own supervisors and afraid of being held responsible for others' mistakes. The client who makes unreasonable demands might be facing budget constraints or deadline pressures they haven't shared with you. This understanding doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior or failing to protect yourself from its consequences. It means responding to difficult people from a position of strength rather than reactivity. When you're not taking their behavior personally, you can think more clearly about effective responses. The third element is recognizing that difficult people often serve useful functions, even when their methods are problematic. Cassius's rebellion, despite its personal cost and political danger, forced me to examine weaknesses in imperial administration that might have remained hidden otherwise. His challenge prompted me to improve communication with provincial governors, strengthen loyalty incentives for key officials, and develop better systems for monitoring potential threats. In your professional life, difficult people often highlight problems that need attention. The colleague who constantly complains might be identifying genuine issues with processes or policies that others are too polite to mention. The client who makes excessive demands might be revealing gaps in your service delivery that affect other clients too. The boss who seems unreasonable might be responding to pressures or constraints that you don't fully understand. This doesn't mean welcoming difficult behavior, but it means extracting useful information from challenging interactions, rather than just suffering through them. Every difficult person becomes a teacher when you approach them with the right mindset. The fourth element of the framework is maintaining your own standards regardless of how others behave. When Cassius rebelled, I could have responded with excessive force, vindictive persecution of his supporters, or by becoming paranoid and suspicious of all advisors. These responses might have felt emotionally satisfying in the moment, but they would have damaged my character and effectiveness as a leader. Instead, I chose to respond with measured force, sufficient to restore order, mercy toward those who surrendered quickly, and fair treatment of Cassius's family members who weren't involved in the rebellion. This approach served both practical and philosophical purposes. It demonstrated that legitimate authority responds to challenges with justice rather than vengeance, and it preserved my own integrity during a situation that could have corrupted it. Your professional integrity must remain constant regardless of others' behavior toward you. You can maintain high standards of work quality even when colleagues are sloppy. You can treat clients with respect even when they're demanding or rude. You can communicate honestly even when others are deceptive. Your character is determined by your choices, not by your circumstances or the people you encounter. The fifth element is understanding when to engage and when to withdraw. Not every difficult person needs to be reformed, and not every challenging situation needs to be resolved through direct confrontation. Sometimes the most effective response is to limit your exposure to problematic people while focusing your energy on relationships and projects that offer better returns on investment. With Cassius, engagement was necessary because his rebellion threatened imperial stability and could not be ignored. But with other difficult people throughout my reign, senators who specialized in obstruction, advisors who constantly promoted their own interests, citizens who seemed determined to complain regardless of policy outcomes, I often chose strategic disengagement rather than exhausting myself in futile attempts to change them. The dagger reminds me that even people who ultimately betray your trust can serve important purposes during the time you work with them. Cassius was an effective military commander and provincial administrator before his rebellion. His contributions to Roman welfare were real, even though his later actions caused significant problems. I can appreciate the value he provided, while also learning from the experience to make better decisions about trust and delegation in the future. This perspective allows you to work with imperfect people, which is to say, all people, without constantly being disappointed by their limitations. You can benefit from colleagues' strengths while developing strategies to manage their weaknesses. You can learn from mentors and bosses while recognizing their blind spots. You can serve clients effectively while maintaining boundaries around their problematic behaviors. The ultimate lesson from the dagger is that difficult people are one of your most valuable training grounds for developing virtue. Every challenging interaction is an opportunity to practice patience, wisdom, courage, and justice. Every test of your character makes you stronger, assuming you respond with virtue rather than allowing others' poor behavior to degrade your own standards. The people who challenge you most are often your greatest teachers, not because they intend to help. You grow, but because they force you to decide who you want to be when tested. Cassius taught me more about leadership, trust, and resilience than many loyal supporters did, precisely because his betrayal required me to practice virtues I might never have developed otherwise. The hourglass that sits on my desk contains sand from the banks of the Danube, gathered during my final campaign against the Germanic tribes. Each grain that falls from the upper chamber to the lower represents a moment that will never return, a decision that cannot be unmade, an opportunity that exists only in the present instant. This simple timepiece became my most powerful teacher in accepting the fundamental truth that governs all existence. Everything changes, nothing lasts, and impermanence is the only permanent feature of life. When I first began studying Stoic philosophy, I intellectually understood that all things are temporary, but intellectual understanding is vastly different from the emotional acceptance that allows you to live peacefully with constant change. For years, I fought against impermanence rather than working with it, trying to create stability in an inherently unstable world, attempting to build permanent solutions to temporary problems. The hourglass taught me to see change not as a threat, to be resisted, but as the natural flow of existence to be navigated skillfully. Just as a sailor doesn't fight against wind and current, but learns to work with these forces to reach desired destinations, wise leaders learn to work with the reality of constant change rather than exhausting themselves in futile attempts to stop it. This lesson became crucial during the economic disruptions that plagued my reign. Trade patterns that had remained stable for generations suddenly shifted due to new transportation routes, changing political alliances, and emerging technologies. Traditional industries declined while new opportunities emerged. Citizens who had built their livelihoods around established systems found themselves struggling to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. My initial response was to try to preserve existing arrangements through imperial intervention, subsidizing declining industries, mandating traditional trading relationships, using government resources to maintain employment in obsolete sectors. I was attempting to stop change rather than helping people navigate it successfully, but the hourglass reminded me that these efforts were like trying to prevent sand from falling. Change would continue regardless of my resistance, but my resistance would prevent me from responding intelligently to new realities. Instead of fighting economic evolution, I could focus on helping people develop skills that would remain valuable regardless of changing circumstances, creating systems that could adapt to new conditions, and building resilience rather than rigidity into imperial structures. This shift from resisting change to working with change transformed my effectiveness as a leader. Instead of wasting energy on preservation efforts that were ultimately doomed, I could direct resources toward adaptation strategies that actually served people's long-term interests, instead of being constantly frustrated by the failure of old approaches. I could become interested in discovering what new approaches might work better. The application to your professional life is profound. How much energy are you spending trying to prevent changes in your industry, your company, or your role? How much anxiety are you carrying about the possibility that your current position might not last forever? How much of your mental resources are consumed by attachment to specific outcomes that may not be achievable given changing circumstances? The hourglass teaches a different approach. Embrace impermanence as the source of all opportunity. If nothing ever changed, there would be no possibility for improvement, growth, or innovation. The temporary nature of current arrangements creates space for better arrangements to emerge. The fact that existing systems will eventually become obsolete means you can contribute to developing superior replacements. I developed what I call impermanence meditation as a daily practice for building emotional acceptance of change. Each morning, as I watched sand fall through the hourglass, I would contemplate specific aspects of my life that I had been unconsciously treating as permanent. My health, my authority, my relationships, my achievements, my challenges, all of these would eventually change or end entirely. This wasn't morbid reflection designed to create depression or fatalism. It was realistic preparation designed to reduce the shock and suffering that comes from unexpected change. When you accept that your current job won't last forever, you're motivated to develop skills that will transfer to future opportunities. When you accept that your current boss will eventually be replaced, you focus on building a reputation that doesn't depend on one person's approval. The most liberating insight from this practice was understanding that impermanence applies to problems as well as pleasures. The difficult client who's making your work life miserable won't be your client forever. The toxic colleague who's undermining team effectiveness won't be on your team forever. The financial pressures that seem overwhelming won't last forever. The industry disruption that appears threatening won't continue forever. This perspective doesn't encourage passive waiting for problems to resolve themselves. Instead, it provides emotional stability that enables strategic response to challenges. When you're not overwhelmed by the assumption that current difficulties will continue indefinitely, you can think more clearly about actions that might improve the situation or help you navigate it more successfully. During the plague years, the hourglass became especially meaningful. Each day brought reports of deaths. Each week brought new complications. Each month extended the crisis beyond what anyone had initially anticipated. The temptation was to assume that these terrible conditions would continue indefinitely, that normal life would never return, that the losses would only continue mounting without limit. But the falling sand reminded me that plagues, like all phenomena, follow natural cycles of emergence, peak intensity, and eventual resolution. This understanding didn't reduce my commitment to relief efforts or make me indifferent to ongoing suffering, but it did prevent me from making decisions based on the assumption that crisis conditions would last forever. I could invest in long-term rebuilding efforts even while managing immediate emergency responses. I could maintain hope for eventual recovery even while accepting the current reality of widespread loss. I could plan for a post-plague future even while fully engaging with plague-related challenges. The hourglass also taught me about the relationship between acceptance and action. Many people assume that accepting impermanence means becoming passive, that recognizing you can't control change means giving up efforts to influence outcomes. But the opposite is true. When you stop wasting energy on futile resistance to change, you have more energy available for skillful response to change. When you accept that your industry will continue evolving, you can focus on staying ahead of those evolutionary trends rather than being overwhelmed by them. When you accept that your company's priorities will shift, you can develop adaptability skills that enable you to remain valuable regardless of what those new priorities turn out to be. When you accept that your career will involve multiple transitions, you can build a foundation of competencies and relationships that support success through various changes. The most profound teaching from the hourglass was understanding that meaning comes not from permanence, but from presence. Since every moment is temporary and irreplaceable, every moment carries the potential for significance. The conversation you're having now will never happen again in exactly this way. The project you're working on today exists only in this specific configuration of circumstances. The problems you're solving this week are unique to this particular time and context. This recognition transforms ordinary work into opportunities for meaning and excellence. You're not just completing routine tasks, you're participating in unrepeatable moments of human collaboration and achievement. You're not just managing temporary challenges, you're contributing to unique historical circumstances that will never occur again. Learn to approach each day's responsibilities with what I call impermanence urgency, the understanding that today's opportunities for service, growth, and contribution are literally irreplaceable. Tomorrow will bring different opportunities, but it will never bring today's opportunities again. This urgency motivated excellence without creating anxiety, because it was based on appreciation rather than fear. The sand continues falling in the hourglass as I write these words, each grain representing another moment of finite time that could be used wisely or wasted carelessly. The choice is always yours. You can fight against the reality of change and exhaust yourself in futile resistance, or you can align yourself with impermanence and discover the freedom that comes from holding everything lightly while caring about everything deeply. Change is not something that happens to you. It's the medium through which you live and work and grow. When you understand this, you stop being a victim of circumstances and become a surfer of change, finding balance and momentum through dynamic adaptation rather than rigid resistance. The impermanence that once seemed threatening becomes the force that carries you toward possibilities you could never have imagined from a fixed position. The Dawn Journal that sits beside my bed contains 19 years of daily entries, thousands of morning reflections, and evening reviews that transformed me from an anxious young ruler into a disciplined philosopher-emperor. These simple leather-bound pages represent the most practical application of Stoic philosophy. The daily habits that gradually build unshakable character through consistent small practices rather than dramatic gestures. Most people approach self-improvement through sporadic bursts of intense effort, reading philosophy books during a crisis, attending seminars when motivation peaks, making dramatic resolutions when dissatisfaction becomes unbearable. But lasting change comes through daily practice. Small, consistent actions that compound over time into fundamental transformation. The Dawn Journal taught me that extraordinary character is built through ordinary practices repeated with extraordinary consistency. My morning routine began before sunrise, when the palace was still quiet and the demands of imperial administration hadn't yet begun clamoring for attention. This wasn't accidental timing. I learned that the quality of your morning preparation determines the quality of your entire day. If you begin reactively, responding immediately to external demands and pressures, you spend the day being controlled by circumstances rather than controlling your response to circumstances. I would begin each morning by writing 3 questions in my journal. Who do I want to be today? What challenges am I likely to face? How can I respond to those challenges in ways that express my highest values? These questions created what I call intentional momentum, energy directed toward worthy goals rather than scattered across reactive responses to whatever seemed most urgent. The first question forced me to clarify my identity and purpose before engaging with specific tasks. Was I going to be an emperor who ruled through fear or through wisdom? Was I going to be a leader who blamed others for problems or who took responsibility for solutions? Was I going to be a person who reacted emotionally to setbacks or who responded strategically to challenges? This daily identity work was crucial because it's easy to lose sight of your core values when you're caught up in the immediate pressures of professional life. Without regular reflection on who you want to be, you end up becoming whoever your circumstances pressure you to become. You adapt to toxic environments by becoming toxic yourself. You respond to unreasonable demands by becoming unreasonable in return. You handle stress by developing stress responses that become permanent personality traits. The second question helped me prepare mentally for likely challenges rather than being caught off guard by predictable difficulties. If I knew a difficult Senate session was scheduled, I could prepare responses that reflected wisdom rather than defensiveness. If I anticipated receiving bad news from provincial governors, I could practice accepting disappointing information without taking it personally. If I expected to face criticism or opposition, I could rehearse maintaining composure rather than reacting emotionally. This preparation wasn't about controlling outcomes. It was about controlling my responses to outcomes. You can't always prevent problems, but you can almost always prepare better responses to problems. The goal wasn't to eliminate challenges, but to meet challenges from a position of strength rather than being overwhelmed by them. The third question connected daily activities to deeper purposes, ensuring that my energy was directed toward actions that actually mattered rather than just actions that seemed urgent. This question forced me to distinguish between motion and progress, between being busy and being effective, between managing immediate pressures and advancing important objectives. After completing my morning reflection, I would spend time reviewing Stoic principles that applied to the day's anticipated challenges. If I expected to face difficult negotiations, I might review teachings about seeing situations from multiple perspectives. If I anticipated receiving criticism, I might reflect on the difference between useful feedback and useless attacks. If I knew the day would bring disappointing news, I might contemplate the distinction between what I could and couldn't control. This wasn't abstract philosophical study. It was practical preparation for applying wisdom under pressure. Just as athletes practice movements repeatedly until they become automatic during competition, I practiced philosophical responses repeatedly until they became automatic during challenging situations. The evening review was equally important but served different purposes. Each night I would write honest assessments of the day's decisions and actions, examining what had gone well and what could be improved. This wasn't self-criticism designed to create guilt or shame, but honest evaluation designed to accelerate learning and character development. I developed a systematic approach to evening reflection, examining each day through 4 categories. Wisdom: did I make decisions based on the best available information, or did I act from ignorance or prejudice? Justice: did I treat people fairly and consider the common good, or did I favor some inappropriately? Courage: did I do what needed to be done despite difficulty or risk, or did I avoid necessary challenges? Temperance: did I maintain self-discipline and moderation, or did I indulge in excess? This framework prevented evening reviews from becoming either self-congratulation sessions that ignored areas for improvement or self-attack sessions that focused only on failures. The 4 virtues provided objective standards for evaluation that were based on character rather than on external results that might be outside my control. The most valuable insights often came from examining the gap between my morning intentions and evening realities. If I had planned to respond to criticism with equanimity, but found myself becoming defensive, this revealed areas where my philosophical understanding needed more practical development. If I had intended to focus on important projects, but spent the day reacting to urgent interruptions, this indicated the need for better systems to protect time for meaningful work. These daily practices gradually created what I call philosophical muscle memory, automatic responses based on virtue rather than emotion. During the Germanic Wars, when military pressures created constant stress and immediate decisions carried life or death consequences, I didn't have to think consciously about Stoic principles because they had become integrated into my natural responses through years of daily practice. The practical application to your professional development is immediate. Most career advancement strategies focus on external activities, networking events, skill development courses, strategic job changes, but the foundation of sustainable success is internal, the daily habits that build character, wisdom, and resilience. that enable you to handle increasing responsibility without being overwhelmed by it. Your morning routine determines whether you approach each day proactively or reactively. If you begin by immediately checking emails, responding to urgent requests, or diving into whatever tasks create the most immediate pressure, you're training yourself to be controlled by external circumstances rather than internal priorities. Instead, begin each day with reflection on your intentions, values, and goals. Ask yourself, what kind of professional do I want to be today? What challenges am I likely to face, and how can I prepare to handle them skillfully? What actions could I take that would move important projects forward regardless of what urgent distractions emerge? This morning preparation creates what I call intentional armor, protection against being pulled off course by the inevitable chaos and pressures of professional life. When you've clarified your priorities and prepared mentally for challenges, you're much more likely to maintain focus on what matters rather than being constantly reactive to whatever seems most urgent. Evening reviews are equally important for accelerating professional development. Instead of just collapsing at the end of difficult days, spend time examining what went well and what could be improved. What decisions would you make differently with current information? What skills need development based on today's challenges? What patterns are you noticing in your responses to stress or conflict? The Dawn Journal reminds me that excellence is never an accident. It's always the result of daily choices accumulated over time. The leader you become tomorrow is determined by the habits you practice today. The character you display under pressure is shaped by the reflection and preparation you do during calm periods. Your career is ultimately the sum of your daily practices. Every morning offers an opportunity to clarify your values and prepare for challenges. Every evening provides a chance to learn from experience and improve future responses. These simple practices, maintained consistently over months and years, create the foundation for professional excellence that can withstand any external pressure or unexpected setback. The pages in my journal are yellowed now, filled with thousands of entries that chronicle my gradual transformation from reactive anxiety to proactive wisdom. Each entry was small in itself, but together they represent the most important work I ever did, the daily practice of becoming the person I wanted to be, rather than just accepting whoever circumstances pressured me to become. The celestial sphere that dominated my private study mapped the positions of stars, planets, and constellations across the vast dome of night sky that arches over our small world. This bronze instrument, crafted by the finest astronomers in Alexandria, became my gateway to the most transformative practice in Stoic philosophy, developing cosmic perspective that reduces ego and increases wisdom by showing you your true place in the infinite scope of existence. When the pressures of imperial leadership felt overwhelming, when senators schemed against policies I believed were necessary, when military campaigns stalled despite careful planning, when economic problems resisted every solution I attempted, I would spend time with this celestial sphere, contemplating the incomprehensible scale of the universe and our infinitesimally small place within it. The practice began as an intellectual exercise, but gradually became an emotional and spiritual discipline that transformed how I responded to both success and failure. When you truly understand how vast the cosmos is and how brief human existence appears within that vastness, most of the concerns that dominate daily attention reveal themselves as far less significant than they initially seemed. Consider the scale we're discussing. Our entire planet is a tiny speck orbiting an ordinary star among hundreds of billions of stars in our galaxy, which is itself one of countless galaxies scattered throughout space so vast that light, the fastest thing in existence, requires billions of years to travel from one edge to another. Human civilization represents a few thousand years within cosmic time scales that extend for billions of years into the past and future. From this perspective, my concerns about whether the Senate would approve specific legislation seemed almost comically insignificant. The Germanic tribes whose raids threatened our northern borders were pursuing survival strategies that would matter for perhaps a few generations before being forgotten entirely. Even the Roman Empire itself, despite seeming permanent and universal, to those who lived within it, was clearly a temporary arrangement that would eventually join the countless other civilizations that had risen and fallen throughout history. This cosmic perspective didn't make me indifferent to my responsibilities or careless about the consequences of my decisions, but it did free me from the anxious attachment that comes from treating temporary arrangements as if they were permanent realities. When you understand that everything human beings build is temporary within cosmic time scales, you can work to build good things without being devastated when those things eventually change or end. The most practical benefit of cosmic perspective was the way it reduced ego-driven decision-making. When your sense of self-worth depends on being right about specific issues, winning particular battles, or maintaining certain status positions, you make decisions based on protecting your image rather than serving larger purposes. But when you accept that individual human importance is negligible within cosmic scales, you can focus entirely on doing what seems right without needing to be proven right. I developed a practice I called cosmic zooming for handling situations that triggered strong emotional reactions. When facing criticism that made me defensive, setbacks that frustrated me, or opposition that angered me, I would mentally zoom out from the immediate situation to progressively larger contexts until I reached cosmic scale. First, I would expand from the immediate moment to the broader day. Would this issue matter by evening? Then to the week. Would anyone care about this problem 7 days from now? Then to the year. Would this situation be significant 12 months later? Then to my lifetime. Would this matter on my deathbed? Then to the century. Would anyone remember this controversy 100 years hence? Finally, to cosmic time. Would this issue have any meaning whatever within the vast scope of universal existence? This progression almost always revealed that situations triggering intense emotional responses were far less significant than they initially appeared. The criticism that seemed personally devastating was actually minor feedback that would be forgotten quickly. The setback that felt like major failure was actually a small adjustment in projects that would succeed or fail based on much larger factors. The opposition that seemed like existential threat was actually routine disagreement that was normal and healthy in any complex organization. Cosmic perspective didn't eliminate the importance of responding appropriately to these situations, but it eliminated the emotional charge that prevented clear thinking about appropriate responses. When you're not overwhelmed by feeling that everything depends on winning this particular battle, you can develop strategies that serve long-term objectives rather than just protecting short-term ego needs. The celestial sphere also taught me about the difference between significance and importance. Cosmic perspective shows that nothing humans do is ultimately significant within the vast scales of space and time. But this doesn't mean human actions are unimportant. Importance is measured by impact on conscious beings who can experience suffering and flourishing, not by permanence within cosmic history. The policies I implemented affected millions of people's daily lives, determining whether they had adequate food, physical security, and opportunities for advancement. These impacts were real and meaningful to the people who experienced them, even though they would eventually be forgotten as historical details. My responsibility was to serve the welfare of conscious beings within my sphere of influence, regardless of whether that service would be remembered or recognized in the distant future. This understanding prevented cosmic perspective from becoming an excuse for nihilistic indifference. Yes, human concerns are insignificant within universal scales, but they're the only concerns that actually matter to human beings. Yes, all civilizations are temporary, but the quality of life within those civilizations while they exist determines whether conscious beings flourish or suffer unnecessarily. The practice became especially valuable during the plague years when the scale of death and suffering threatened to overwhelm my capacity to function effectively. Watching entire communities destroyed by disease, seeing families torn apart by loss, witnessing the apparent randomness with which death claimed both virtuous and corrupt people, these experiences could easily lead to despair about the meaninglessness of human effort. But cosmic perspective provided a different framework for understanding these tragedies. Plagues, like earthquakes and storms, are natural phenomena that occur within biological and physical systems that operate according to discoverable patterns. From a cosmic viewpoint, disease outbreaks are simply part of the larger processes through which matter and energy organize and reorganize themselves throughout the universe. This perspective didn't reduce my compassion for plague victims or my commitment to relief efforts, but it did prevent me from taking the plague personally, from interpreting it as evidence that the universe was hostile to human welfare, or that my leadership was somehow responsible for natural disasters. I could respond to suffering with full emotional engagement while maintaining the intellectual clarity needed for effective action. Your professional challenges become much more manageable when viewed through cosmic perspective. The client who rejected your proposal isn't delivering a verdict on your fundamental worth as a human being. They're making a business decision based on factors you may not fully understand, within circumstances that will change completely within a few years. The colleague who undermines your projects isn't threatening your cosmic significance. They're pursuing their own goals within temporary organizational arrangements that will evolve regardless of current conflicts. The promotion you didn't receive isn't evidence that your efforts are meaningless. It's one decision made by a few people within systems that will be completely different within a decade. The industry disruption that threatens your current role isn't proof that your skills are worthless. It's part of the constant change that characterizes all human institutions within the broader evolution of technology and society. I learned to approach each challenge by asking, within the vast scope of space and time, how significant is this problem really? This question almost always revealed that my emotional response was disproportionate to the actual importance of the situation. This didn't mean the problem wasn't worth addressing, but it meant I could address it from a position of calm clarity rather than anxious reactivity. The most profound insight from cosmic perspective was understanding that meaning comes not from permanence or universal significance, but from conscious choice to create value for other conscious beings within whatever time and circumstances you've been given. You don't need your work to last forever for it to be meaningful. You need your work to serve the flourishing of people who can experience the benefits of that service. The celestial sphere continues to map the infinite cosmos that provides context for all human activity. Every star represents a sun that might warm planets where conscious beings struggle with challenges similar to ours. Every galaxy contains billions of opportunities for matter to organize itself into forms capable of experience, growth, and wisdom. We are part of something incomprehensibly vast and beautiful, and our small contributions to consciousness and flourishing within that vastness are both insignificant and precious. Cosmic perspective teaches that you are simultaneously less important and more important than you usually imagine. Less important because individual human concerns barely register within universal scales. More important because conscious beings like yourself are among the rarest and most remarkable phenomena in existence, capable of understanding, caring, and choosing responses that increase rather than decrease the total amount of wisdom and compassion in the cosmos. The succession documents that ensured peaceful transition of power to my son Commodus represent both my greatest hope and my deepest concern about legacy. These carefully crafted papers were meant to preserve the principles and systems that had brought stability to the empire, but they also forced me to confront the sobering reality that no leader can guarantee how their life's work will be continued by others. True legacy lies not in controlling what happens after you're gone, but in creating value that transcends your personal involvement. As I prepared these documents during my final campaign along the Danube, I was forced to examine everything I had built through the lens of permanence. Which policies would survive changes in leadership? Which institutions could function without my personal oversight? Which principles were robust enough to guide future decisions when I was no longer available to explain their application? These questions revealed uncomfortable truths about the difference between personal achievement and lasting impact. Most of what we consider our professional accomplishments are actually highly dependent on our continued personal involvement. The projects we manage exist because we're managing them. The relationships we've built rely on our ongoing maintenance. The influence we exercise depends on our current position and authority. When we're no longer present to sustain these achievements, many of them simply disappear, like footprints in sand that are erased by the next wave. But some contributions create value that extends far beyond our personal involvement. These are the investments in other people's development, the systems that function independently of their creators, the principles that continue guiding decisions long after we've moved on to different roles or departed entirely. Building this kind of lasting legacy requires thinking beyond personal credit and immediate results to focus on what will serve others when you're no longer there to serve them directly. I learned this lesson painfully during my early years as emperor, when I focused primarily on solving immediate problems through direct imperial intervention. Whenever conflicts arose between provinces, I would personally mediate the disputes. When economic difficulties emerged in specific regions, I would personally design relief measures. When military threats appeared on our borders, I would personally develop strategic responses. This approach produced good short-term results. Problems were resolved, people were helped, threats were neutralized. But it also created dangerous dependencies on my personal involvement. Provincial governors became accustomed to referring difficult decisions to imperial authority rather than developing their own problem-solving capabilities. Economic systems became reliant on central intervention rather than building local resilience. Military commanders waited for detailed instructions rather than exercising strategic initiative. The succession documents forced me to confront the weakness of this leadership approach. If everything depended on my personal judgment and involvement, what would happen when I was no longer available? Would the empire's effectiveness collapse simply because one person was no longer making all the important decisions? This realization led me to completely restructure my approach to leadership, shifting from personal problem-solving to systematic capacity building. Instead of resolving every dispute myself, I established clear principles and procedures that others could use to resolve similar disputes consistently. Instead of designing custom solutions for each economic crisis, I created institutional mechanisms that could respond flexibly to various challenges. Instead of micromanaging military operations, I focused on training commanders who could make sound strategic decisions independently. The transformation was difficult because it required giving up the immediate satisfaction of personal control and direct impact. It's emotionally rewarding to be the person who solves important problems, who makes crucial decisions, who receives credit for significant achievements. Building systems and developing other people's capabilities is less immediately gratifying because the results are indirect and the credit is shared or given away entirely. But this shift from personal achievement to systemic contribution proved to be the most valuable work I did as emperor. The policies I implemented personally were eventually changed by future leaders according to their own judgment and circumstances. but the decision-making frameworks I established continued guiding imperial administration long after my specific policies were forgotten. The individuals I trained continued applying principles I had taught them to situations I never could have anticipated. Your professional legacy will be determined by the same choice. Do you focus primarily on personal achievements that depend on your continued involvement, or do you invest in creating value that will serve others when you're no longer present? Do you solve problems yourself to demonstrate your competence, or do you teach others problem-solving approaches that will help them handle challenges you'll never see? I developed what I call legacy thinking for evaluating how to spend time and energy most effectively. Before committing to any significant project or decision, I would ask, will this create value that extends beyond my personal involvement? Will this teach others capabilities they can apply independently? Will this establish principles or systems that can guide future decisions when I'm not available to make them? These questions often led me to choose less glamorous but more impactful approaches to challenges. Instead of personally negotiating every important treaty, I invested time in training diplomatic corps who could handle negotiations according to consistent principles. Instead of reviewing every significant policy proposal myself, I developed evaluation criteria that others could apply to assess proposals systematically. Instead of personally mentoring every promising young leader, I created educational programs that could develop leadership capabilities at scale. The succession documents also taught me about the limitation of trying to control your legacy through formal mechanisms. Despite careful planning, detailed instructions, and systematic preparation, Commodus would ultimately rule according to his own character and judgment, not according to my preferences and expectations. The most elaborate succession planning cannot guarantee that your life's work will be continued exactly as you intended. This reality was initially devastating to contemplate. If I couldn't ensure that my policies would be maintained and my principles would be followed, what was the point of trying to build anything lasting? But I gradually understood that true legacy doesn't depend on others continuing your specific approaches. It depends on contributing value that serves human flourishing regardless of how that contribution is later modified or replaced. The roads I built would eventually require maintenance and reconstruction, but they would serve travelers and commerce for centuries in various forms. The legal principles I established would eventually be revised and updated, but they would provide foundations for justice that future generations could build upon. The philosophical practices I documented would eventually be interpreted differently by other practitioners, but they would continue helping people develop wisdom and resilience through changing circumstances. This understanding freed me from the anxious need to control how my contributions would be used after my death. Instead of trying to bind future generations to my specific solutions, I could focus on creating tools, principles, and capabilities that would help them develop their own solutions to whatever challenges they faced. The most lasting aspect of any legacy is the impact on other people's character and capabilities. The specific projects you complete will eventually be replaced by better projects. The particular problems you solve will eventually be superseded by different problems. But the people you influence, teach, and develop will carry forward something of what they learned from you into all their future endeavors. I realized that my most important legacy would not be found in policy documents or institutional structures, but in the minds and characters of people who had worked with me, learned from me, or been affected by my example. Every person who became more thoughtful, more principled, more resilient, or more capable because of their interaction with me would carry forward some aspect of what I had tried to achieve, applying it in ways I could never predict or control. This meant that the most important work I could do was not building monuments to my own achievements, but investing in other people's development. Every conversation that helped someone think more clearly, every decision that demonstrated principles worth emulating, every response to crisis that showed others how to maintain virtue under pressure, These were the contributions that would continue influencing the world long after my specific policies were forgotten. Your professional legacy will be determined by the same principle. The projects you complete and the positions you hold are temporary achievements that will eventually be replaced by other people's work. But the impact you have on colleagues, employees, clients, and competitors through your example, teaching, and character will ripple forward through all their future activities and relationships. The succession documents remind me that legacy is not about ensuring that others continue doing exactly what you did, but about contributing capabilities and principles that help others do better than what you did. True success as a leader means becoming unnecessary, creating so much value through other people's development that they can handle future challenges more effectively than you could have handled them yourself. When you focus on building lasting legacy rather than just achieving personal success, your entire approach to work transforms. You become more interested in teaching than in impressing. You become more committed to developing systems than to controlling outcomes. You become more focused on serving principles than on advancing your own interests. And paradoxically, this shift toward legacy thinking often produces better immediate results than direct pursuit of personal achievement. The documents sit in imperial archives now, their specific provisions long since superseded by changed circumstances and different leadership approaches. But the principle they represent, that leaders exist to serve something larger than themselves, continues guiding those who understand that true power comes not from what you can force others to do while you're present, but from what you can inspire them to become when you're no longer there to guide them. The deathbed scroll that contains my final philosophical reflections was written as I felt life ebbing away in my tent along the Danube frontier, surrounded by the sounds of a military camp preparing for battles I would never see. These last thoughts represent the distilled essence of 19 years practicing Stoic philosophy under the ultimate pressures of imperial responsibility, a lifetime's learning compressed into wisdom that I hope will serve you long after my voice has been silenced by death. As I write these final words, I am struck by how simple the most important truths actually are, and how much unnecessary complexity we create by resisting what we already know to be right. The Stoic principles that transformed me from an anxious young ruler into a disciplined leader are not mysterious secrets available only to emperors and philosophers. They are practical tools that anyone can use to build unshakable character and find meaning in whatever circumstances life presents. The inner citadel I built through decades of practice, that fortress of the mind that no external pressure could breach, is available to you regardless of your position, resources, or natural talents. It requires no special advantages, no inherited gifts, no favorable circumstances. It requires only the willingness to take responsibility for your own thoughts, responses, and character development day after day, choice after choice, until virtue becomes as natural as breathing. You face the same fundamental challenges I faced as emperor, though your specific circumstances are different. You must make decisions without complete information, while others judge the wisdom of those decisions based on outcomes you cannot control. You must maintain your principles while working within systems that often reward compromise and expedience. You must serve others' welfare while protecting your own capacity to continue serving. You must build something meaningful, knowing that everything you build is temporary. The workplace pressures that overwhelm you, demanding deadlines, difficult colleagues, organizational chaos, industry uncertainty, are simply the contemporary versions of the plagues, wars, political opposition, and administrative complexity that tested every principle I ever learned. The anxiety you feel about career advancement, job security, and professional recognition reflects the same human concerns about status, safety, and significance that have challenged people in every era and every role. But here is what I want you to understand as clearly as possible. These external pressures cannot touch your essential worth unless you allow them to do so. Your value as a human being is not determined by your job title, your salary, your boss's opinion, your industry's health, or your company's stock price. Your worth is determined by your character, and your character is determined by how you choose to respond to exactly the circumstances you're facing right now. The 3 disciplines that saved my sanity and effectiveness as a leader will work just as powerfully in your professional life. The discipline of desire means wanting what you have rather than constantly craving what you lack, finding ways to excel within your current circumstances rather than postponing engagement until circumstances improve. The discipline of action means focusing on the quality of your efforts rather than demanding specific outcomes from those efforts. The discipline of assent means controlling your interpretations of events rather than being controlled by automatic, emotional reactions to whatever happens around you. These are not abstract philosophical concepts, but intensely practical skills that will determine whether you thrive or merely survive in whatever challenges your career presents. When you master these disciplines, you become immune to the manipulation that comes from making your peace of mind dependent on factors outside your control. You can work with full commitment while remaining unattached to whether that work receives the recognition you believe it deserves. I have watched too many capable people destroy their effectiveness and happiness by fighting against realities they cannot change, rather than working skillfully within the constraints those realities create. I have seen brilliant minds paralyzed by perfectionism, generous hearts broken by ingratitude, and strong spirits crushed by the weight of trying to control outcomes that depend on far more than individual effort. But I have also seen ordinary people become extraordinary through the daily practice of Stoic principles. I have watched anxious beginners develop unshakable calm through meditation on what they could and couldn't control. I have seen reactive personalities transform into strategic thinkers through consistent evening reviews and morning preparations. I have witnessed ambitious climbers discover profound satisfaction through shifting focus from personal advancement to principled service. The transformation is always possible, but it requires consistent practice rather than sporadic inspiration. You cannot develop philosophical strength through crisis reading any more than you can develop physical strength through emergency exercise. The inner citadel is built through daily choices to practice virtue when virtue is difficult, to maintain discipline when discipline is inconvenient, to serve principles when principles conflict with immediate interests. Start where you are, with whatever challenges you're currently facing. The difficult project that seems impossible becomes an opportunity to practice persistence and creativity. The unreasonable boss becomes a chance to develop patience and strategic thinking. The toxic colleague becomes training for maintaining your own standards regardless of others' behavior. The industry disruption becomes motivation for building adaptable capabilities rather than depending on permanent arrangements. Every professional challenge becomes a gymnasium for developing character when you approach it with the right mindset. The goal is not to eliminate difficulties, but to become the kind of person who can handle any difficulty with grace, wisdom, and effectiveness. The goal is not to control external circumstances, but to develop such complete mastery over your own responses that external circumstances cannot determine your peace of mind or your ability to contribute value. As my life ends, I am not thinking about the specific policies I implemented, the particular battles I won or lost, or the temporary arrangements I established that future leaders will modify according to their own judgment. I am thinking about the people I influenced, the principles I demonstrated, and the example I provided of what becomes possible when someone commits fully to developing virtue under pressure. Your legacy will be determined by the same factors. The specific projects you complete will eventually be replaced by other projects. The particular positions you hold will eventually be filled by other people. But the character you develop and the influence you have on others' character will ripple forward through countless future decisions and relationships in ways you will never see. But that will matter more than anything else you accomplish. The empire I leave behind is temporary, all empires are. But the ideas I have tried to live by are eternal, because they reflect permanent truths about what enables human beings to flourish, regardless of their external circumstances. These truths do not belong to emperors or philosophers, but to anyone willing to practice them consistently and courageously. Build your inner empire with the same dedication you bring to building your external career. Develop unshakable principles that will guide you through any professional chaos. Create practices that maintain your character regardless of how others behave around you. Focus on becoming someone worth being, rather than just someone worth. Envying the workplace pressures that seem overwhelming today will pass, as all pressures do. The colleagues who frustrate you will move on to other roles. The bosses who challenge you will be replaced by different bosses with different challenges. The industries that seem permanent will evolve beyond recognition. But the person you become through responding to these temporary circumstances with virtue will remain with you through every future change and challenge. They don't want you to think like a Stoic emperor because they profit from your anxiety, your reactivity, your dependence on external validation, and your belief that your peace of mind depends on circumstances you cannot control. But you can choose to develop the same unshakable inner strength that sustained me through plagues, wars, political opposition, and the ultimate test of mortality itself. The choice is yours, as it has always been. You can continue being controlled by circumstances, or you can begin today building the character that will enable you to remain calm, wise, and effective, regardless of what circumstances arise. You can continue postponing your engagement with life until conditions improve, or you can start now finding ways to excel within whatever conditions actually exist. The scroll grows heavy in my weakening hands, but these final words carry the full weight of a lifetime's learning. You already have everything you need to build an inner citadel that no external pressure can breach. You already possess the capacity for wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance that will transform any professional challenge into an opportunity for growth. You already are capable of the disciplined thinking and principled action that will create meaningful legacy regardless of your current circumstances. Begin now. Begin today. Begin with the next choice you make about how to respond to whatever pressure you're currently facing. The emperor within you is waiting to be awakened through the daily practice of virtue, and that emperor's reign will last as long as you continue choosing character over convenience, principles over pressure, and service over selfishness. The empire you build within yourself will be your most lasting achievement and your greatest gift to a world that desperately needs more people who can remain wise when others panic, just when others compromise, brave when others retreat, and temperate when others indulge. Build that empire now, one choice at a time, one day at a time, until virtue becomes your nature and peace becomes your permanent residence.